The morning of December 7th, 1941, is remembered in our world as a thunderclap in history. The still waters of Pearl Harbor were broken by fire and steel, a sudden storm that pulled the United States into the war that was already consuming Europe and Asia. But imagine for a moment that the waters remained calm. Imagine that on that morning the sky stayed empty, no aircraft diving from the clouds, no torpedoes streaking toward anchored ships, no great plume of smoke rising over Oahu. Imagine the harbor as quiet as a sleeping child, and the world, at least for a time, still balanced on the edge of uncertainty. What might have happened if Japan had chosen a different path? If the United States had not been hurled overnight into global war? Before we begin this long journey through alternate history, let us pause together in this moment. You, listening now in the stillness of your own evening, are part of the great web of memory. The decisions of the past shape the lives we live today. As you listen, let the words flow slowly, like waves against a quiet shore, and if you find comfort in this exploration, remember to subscribe and support the channel. Now, let us step into the silent harbor of December 1941 and begin. The harbor is still. The Pacific rolls with a gentle rhythm, the ships of the American fleet resting in neat rows, their decks bright under the Hawaiian Sunday. No warning sirens, no columns of black smoke, no frantic cries over radios. Instead, the sailors go about their duties, unaware that across the ocean in Tokyo, a decision has shifted the course of the world. Japan has not attacked. The surprise that altered our history never came. In this quiet, we hear the sound of possibilities opening, like doors along a darkened corridor. In our true timeline, Pearl Harbor shocked the American people into unity. Isolationist debates fell silent, and the nation leapt into war with sudden, furious energy. But without that catalyst, what would America have been? In 1941, the United States was a giant not yet stirred. Its industries were vast, its manpower immense, but its people were divided. Many still believed the oceans protected them, that Europe's troubles were Europe's alone, that Asia's conflicts were distant storms. Roosevelt's voice carried warnings, but Congress remained cautious, and public opinion uncertain. Without Pearl Harbor, the debate might have stretched on like a tug-of-war, rope-pulling taut yet refusing to snap. We must remember that in 1941 Europe was already deep in shadow. France had fallen. The swastika flew over Paris. Britain stood battered but unbowed, bombed night after night, its cities scarred with fire. The Soviet Union, vast and wounded, struggled against the German invasion, losing millions in the first desperate months. And yet America watched from across the sea, providing aid but not men, weapons but not armies. Without Pearl Harbor, it is possible this watching stance might have continued, hesitant, half-committed, always delaying the moment of full entry. But delay can change everything. Imagine Britain, standing alone under constant assault, eyes always turned westward, waiting for the giant across the ocean to wake. Without American entry in 1941 or 1942, would Churchill's government have endured? Would morale have cracked like glass under hammer blows? Could Britain have been forced into negotiation, a bitter compromise with Germany to preserve survival? The thought lingers like fog over a battlefield, indistinct but heavy. Consider too the Soviet Union. The Red Army held, but only barely. Supplies from America trucks, food, aircraft were lifelines delivered through the dangerous Arctic convoys. If those supplies were delayed or never sent in enough volume, could the Soviet lines have buckled under German pressure? Could Moscow have fallen, Stalingrad never defended, the Eastern Front reshaped entirely? The image is haunting. German banners flying further east, the map of Eurasia redrawn under a different balance of power. And what of Japan itself? Without attacking Pearl Harbor, Tokyo might have pursued other strategies. It could have focused on expansion into the European colonies of Southeast Asia, aiming at the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber plantations of Malaya, the rich resources of the region. America might still have opposed such moves diplomatically, but would it have risked war without the direct provocation of an attack? Perhaps Washington would have held back, seeking negotiations, hoping to restrain Japan with embargoes rather than bullets. The Pacific might have become a chessboard of slow moves instead of a sudden battlefield of fire. There is a strange quiet in this imagined world. It is not the roar of war, but the silence of hesitation. Every leader in 1941 faced choices like doors along a hallway, and in this timeline the doors open differently. Roosevelt paces the Oval Office, aware of the threat but bound by politics. Churchill gazes across the Atlantic, waiting for an ally who may never come. Stalin clenches his jaw in the Kremlin, alone, wondering if reinforcements will ever arrive. And in Tokyo, generals debate, cautious, calculating, measuring whether a strike against the sleeping giant is worth the risk. History often turns not on inevitability but on decisions. A storm does not always break. Sometimes the clouds pass without rain. Yet the absence of action creates new dangers. Without America's early entry, the Axis powers may find more room to maneuver, more time to consolidate. Britain may falter. The Soviet Union may bleed beyond endurance. Japan may dominate Asia unchecked. Or perhaps, paradoxically, delay gives America an even greater advantage. Later, more time to arm, more time to prepare, more time to awaken, not in shock, but in deliberate strength. As the day ends in Hawaii, the sailors of the Pacific Fleet watch the sun dip toward the horizon. They laugh, they write letters, they do not know what might have been. Across the ocean, diplomats draft cables, generals shuffle maps, leaders weigh their choices. The world holds its breath. In this silence, history bends, and we, peering through the mists of possibility, begin to trace the paths that might unfold. And yet, in the calm waters of Pearl Harbor, one detail waits like a seed. America's factories, still humming with peacetime production, lie dormant. Their potential is immense, but will they be awakened in time? In our next step, we must follow this thread and consider what it means when the giant sleeps longer, when the arsenal of democracy waits in shadows. The giant sleeps, and while its factories wait in the shadows, across the ocean, an island nation struggles beneath relentless skies. Britain, scarred by years of war, holds out like a lighthouse battered by storm waves, its beam flickering yet still burning. Each night, the air raid sirens wail, and families descend into shelters as the distant drone of bombers grows louder. London smolders, Coventry lies in ruins, Liverpool endures the pounding of bombs. In our history, Britain endured because it believed that America would come sooner or later, that help would arrive like reinforcements riding the tide. But in this alternate thread, without Pearl Harbor to tear down the wall of isolation, that belief grows fragile, like a candle guttering in the wind. Churchill was a man of bulldog spirit, but even bulldogs tire when cornered. Imagine him at his desk in the cabinet war rooms, smoke curling from his cigar, maps spread across the table. He listens to reports of dwindling supplies, of ships sunk in the Atlantic, of men lost in desert sands. And behind every number lies the same question: how long can Britain fight alone? The United States, in this reality, continues to send weapons, perhaps more slowly, perhaps with greater political hesitation. But weapons without soldiers are like water without a vessel, they spill away under the pressure of events. Could Churchill, faced with endless nights of bombing, growing fatigue, and uncertain support, be forced to consider negotiation with Germany, something he rejected so fiercely in our world? The image unsettles us. A Britain not standing defiant, but seeking survival through compromise, its proud roar reduced to a cautious whisper, and if Britain falters, what of Europe? The German war machine, no longer fearing an American front, can pour its strength eastward against the Soviet Union. The swastika already stretched across the continent. Without Britain as a base of resistance, without the constant hope of American troops one day landing on European shores, Germany could tighten its grip like a fist closing around a captive bird. A negotiated peace with Britain might leave the continent divided by treaty lines, with Hitler's empire legitimized, at least for a season, while the Soviet Union remains locked in brutal struggle. Yet Britain was not only a victim of bombs, it was also a colonial power. Its empire stretched across the globe. In the Middle East, in India, in Africa, British forces held sway. If London were weakened, could its colonies be drawn into instability? Could nationalist movements sense opportunity in the mother country's wavering resolve? The empire, already strained, might begin to fracture. And with America still reluctant to intervene, Japan could find an opening. For Japan, the British colonies in Asia were ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong, these jewels could fall more easily if Britain stood alone, tired and desperate. We must imagine, then, a world where the thunder of German bombs is not met with the steady promise of American aid, but with silence. Each raid chips away not just at buildings, but at morale. Each convoy sunk in the Atlantic is not quickly replaced, but leaves a gap that stretches wider. The British people, resilient though they were, could not endure forever without hope. And hope is a delicate thing. It is the belief that tomorrow will bring allies, that sacrifices will not be in vain. Remove that hope, and even the strongest hearts may bend. At the same time, Britain's position might lead to desperate diplomacy. Perhaps Churchill, or a successor less steadfast, would open quiet channels to Berlin, seeking terms. Perhaps Hitler, emboldened by the absence of American opposition, would seize the chance to consolidate Europe with a piece of dominance. Imagine a treaty signed not in triumph, but in exhaustion, a handshake across the ruins. The war in Europe might not end in liberation, but in compromise, an uneasy arrangement that leaves the continent carved into spheres of influence. Nazi power entrenched, Britain diminished, and America still watching from across the sea. But history is never one straight line. There is always another possibility. Perhaps Britain would endure regardless, driven by stubborn pride and the belief that surrender was unthinkable. Perhaps the empire's resources, though strained, would continue to feed the island's resistance. Perhaps the people, scarred but defiant, would hold on long enough for America to finally awaken, for some other spark to bring the giant into battle. History is a web, and each strand holds both fragility and resilience. Britain might break, or it might bend but never snap. In this silence of alternate history, one hears the ticking of a clock. Each day that passes without America's entry is another day Britain stands alone. Each night of bombers overhead is another night of doubt. And while Britain endures, it casts its eyes eastward, to the vast struggle unfolding in the Soviet Union. For if Britain was the lighthouse in the storm, the Soviet Union was the forest fire, consuming men and machines in a blaze of unimaginable scale. Whether Britain could endure depended not only on its own strength, but on the ability of the Soviets to hold the line. Without America, both faced storms alone, each one watching the other, wondering how long the other could stand. And so, the image of Britain becomes a question. Can a single island, proud and scarred, hold out against the weight of a continent, united under the swastika, without the certainty of America's intervention? Does it resist to the bitter end, or does it bend to survive? The answer is unclear, a shadow on the wall, shifting with the light. What we know is that without Pearl Harbor, without the roar of American engines crossing the Atlantic, Britain's fate was more fragile, its endurance less certain. And this uncertainty opens the next layer of our exploration, drawing us eastward to the endless steppes of Russia, where another fate was being decided. Eastward, the winds blow, carrying with them the echoes of bombs that fall on Britain, sweeping across the cold waters of the Baltic, over fields that once belonged to Poland, and into the boundless spaces of the Soviet Union. There, in the winter of 1941, the land is a canvas of snow and ash, dotted with the frozen bodies of soldiers who marched too far into a storm. The German army, mighty and relentless, has surged deep into Russia. Cities are under siege, villages lie burned, and the people flee before the invader, like shadows retreating before fire. And yet, in this alternate world, the Soviet Union faces its trial with even less support than in the history we know. For without America's full entry into the war, the lifeline that carried trucks, aircraft, and food across the oceans is thinner, weaker, always at risk of breaking. Imagine the vast convoys that sailed from American ports in our reality, great steel ships cutting through icy seas, laden with supplies bound for Murmansk and Archangel. Many were lost to German submarines, but many more arrived, carrying with them the strength of American industry. In this world, without the shock of Pearl Harbor to bring the United States fully into the fight, the convoys are smaller, delayed, perhaps not launched at all. The Red Army, already battered, must rely more heavily on its own stretched resources. Tanks break down without spare parts, soldiers march on empty stomachs, aircraft remain grounded for lack of fuel. Every small delay magnifies the suffering of millions, and still, the Germans press forward. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's great gamble, was already a storm of unimaginable violence. Millions of soldiers clashed across a front stretching for 1,000 miles. Without American supplies, might that storm have blown differently? Might Moscow, which in our history stood defiant through the bitter winter, have fallen into German hands? Picture the Red Star torn down from the Kremlin, replaced by the swastika, the city's broad avenues echoing with German boots. It is not unthinkable, for in late 1941, the Soviet defense was desperate, the margin of survival slim. Without convoys, without trucks to move men and supplies, without food to feed an army, that margin narrows even further. The snow could have covered not only the fallen soldiers, but the hopes of a nation. Yet the Soviet Union was a land of endurance. Its people had lived through revolutions, famines, purges. The Russian winter itself was a weapon, turning roads into quagmires, tanks into frozen hulks, soldiers into statues of ice. Even if Moscow fell, could the Soviet Union truly be conquered? Perhaps the government would retreat beyond the Urals, factories dismantled and rebuilt in Siberia, armies raised again from the endless depth of its population. The war might not end in swift German victory, but in a grinding, endless struggle, a furnace that consumed both empires. Germany might advance further, but in doing so, might also overreach, stretching its supply lines until they snapped. The snow does not favor ambition. Still, we must imagine the consequences if the Soviets were weaker, if their resistance faltered. For Britain, clinging to survival, the fall of Moscow would be a blow like a hammer against an already cracked stone. With the Soviet Union crushed, Germany would be free to turn westward, its armies reinforced, its power magnified. And for Japan, watching from across Asia, the fall of the Soviet Union might open tempting opportunities. In our history, Japan looked south, toward the oil and rubber of Southeast Asia, but it had also considered striking north, against Siberia. With the Soviet Union broken, could Japan have extended its reach into the vast, resource-rich expanses of Siberia, linking hands with Germany across the heart of Eurasia? The map of the world begins to shift in unsettling ways, the colors of empire spreading like ink across paper. But the Soviet Union was never just a military machine, it was also an idea. Communism, for all its brutality under Stalin, carried with it a vision of resistance to fascism. If the Soviets collapsed, what would happen to that vision? Would the movements of resistance in Europe, the partisans in forests, the underground networks in cities, lose hope without the Red Army to inspire them? Would Nazism appear unstoppable, its banners the only ones still flying? Or would desperation spark new forms of rebellion, flames of defiance lit in darkened corners of Europe? The possibilities unfold like cracks in ice, branching in all directions. And through all of this, America remains hesitant. Roosevelt, watching reports of Moscow's peril, knows the danger. He knows that if Germany crushes the Soviet Union, Britain cannot stand alone for long. But he also knows his people are reluctant, their memories of the First World War still fresh, their desire for peace strong. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, without the image of burning ships and lost sailors to galvanize opinion, can he rally the nation to war on behalf of distant allies? Or does he wait, hoping that Britain and the Soviet Union can endure just long enough for another event, another spark to awaken America? The clock ticks, and with each hour, the weight upon Britain and Russia grows heavier. In the silence of speculation, one sees the image of Stalin at his desk, the map of Russia stretched before him like a wounded body. He clenches his pipe between his teeth, his eyes fixed on the Western Front. The reports are grim. Men are dying faster than they can be replaced. Supplies are dwindling. He knows the convoys are not enough. He knows America hesitates. And perhaps, in this alternate world, he wonders if he must seek a different path. Could Stalin, faced with annihilation, seek terms with Germany? Could there be a monstrous pact, a division of spheres of influence across Eurasia, a return to cynical diplomacy? The thought chills us, for it suggests a Europe where the two greatest tyrannies, once at war, might instead coexist, carving the continent between them. Or perhaps the opposite occurs. Perhaps Soviet defiance grows even stronger in the absence of allies. Perhaps the knowledge that they are alone steals the resolve of soldiers, women, children, all united in defense of their homeland. The Red Army, desperate and starving, might still find the strength to strike back. After all, history is not merely made of weapons and supplies, it is also made of will. And the will of a people fighting for survival can be as unbreakable as iron. The snow continues to fall. The cities of Russia burn, yet life continues beneath the ashes. Farmers still plant grain in the black soil. Children still sing songs by the fireside. Soldiers still march, their boots crunching over frost. The war is not yet decided. It stretches forward, a path lined with shadows and uncertainty. And while the Soviet Union fights, while Britain waits, while America hesitates, Japan watches carefully from across the sea, measuring its own opportunities in the silence of the Pacific. Across the seas, far from the frozen rivers of Russia, the rising sun hovers over Tokyo, its glow reaching across a restless empire. Japan watches carefully, its generals and ministers gathered in smoke-filled rooms, their voices low, their maps spread wide. In our history, they chose to strike at Pearl Harbor, to hurl the dice in a gamble of thunder. But in this world, restraint wins the day. The bombs remain on the wings of aircraft that never launch. The torpedoes remain in the bellies of submarines that never surface. And so Japan, restless, ambitious, turns its gaze elsewhere, searching for paths less direct, but perhaps more subtle. The Pacific, vast and silent, becomes not a battlefield of fire, but a chessboard of maneuvers, each move measured against the patience of rivals. The Empire of Japan in 1941 already stretched wide. Korea and Manchuria were under its control, China groaned beneath the weight of years of war, and its armies, though bloodied, remained determined. Yet Japan's ambitions were always larger than its resources. Oil, rubber, and steel without these, its vast machinery of war could not function. In our reality, the attack on Pearl Harbor was driven by the American embargo, the belief that unless the United States was struck down, Japan's access to resources would be strangled. But imagine instead that Tokyo sought to work around the blockade, probing south into the European colonies of Southeast Asia, hoping to seize the riches of the Dutch East Indies, the plantations of Malaya, the harbors of Singapore. These were prizes gleaming like jewels, vulnerable with their European masters, distracted by war in Europe. Picture the map. To the south lies the Dutch East Indies, its islands rich in oil fields that glisten beneath tropical suns. To the west, Malaya's plantations stretch like green carpets, promising rubber for tires, tin for factories. Singapore, fortress of the British, sits at the gateway of the seas, a key that could unlock the routes to the Indian Ocean. If Japan avoids striking the United States directly, could it move against these colonies piecemeal, daring Britain to respond, knowing that the island empire is already stretched thin? Without America as an active combatant, Britain's ability to defend its eastern possessions is fragile, like a fraying rope pulled too tight. Japanese soldiers might march through jungles unopposed, their flag unfurling over lands abandoned or too weakly held to resist. Yet, this strategy carries its own risks. Even without Pearl Harbor, America watches carefully. Roosevelt knows that Japanese expansion southward threatens not only European colonies, but also American interests in the Philippines. Each move Japan makes pushes closer to confrontation. Would America stand aside as Japan seized Malaya or the Indies? Or would Washington, though hesitant, finally act, provoked not by bombs falling on Pearl Harbor, but by creeping expansion that could not be ignored? The danger lies in the ambiguity. Without a sudden attack, public outrage might not unite the American people. The government might hesitate, debates might stretch on, and Japan could hope to consolidate its conquests before America decided to intervene. The clock ticks once more, and every day of hesitation becomes a gift to the empire of the rising Sunday. But there is another possibility, whispered in the corridors of Tokyo. What if Japan turned not south, but north? What if, seeing Germany press deep into Russia, Tokyo decided to strike at Siberia, to fulfill the dreams of those who believed in a northern advance? The Soviet Union, already reeling under German assault, might find itself struck again. From behind, its defenses stretched beyond endurance. The oil of Sakhalin, the timber of Siberia, the resources of the Far East could fall into Japanese hands. And with Moscow perhaps tottering, a Japanese thrust northward might have seemed a safer gamble than confronting the United States directly. Imagine Japanese soldiers marching across snowfields, their banners snapping in the icy wind, their tanks rolling along frozen rivers, converging with German divisions pushing east. A meeting of allies across the steppes, a handshake between two empires that had once seemed distant. The world map shifts again, its balance tilting further toward the axis, and yet Japan's leaders were cautious as much as they were bold. The memory of Nomonhan, the disastrous clash with Soviet forces in 1939, still lingered. The Red Army had proven formidable in those battles, and Japan hesitated to provoke it again. The southern path promised resources and glory. The northern path risked entanglement in a vast land war. In this alternate world, the debate might have stretched longer, the decision postponed, the empire caught between hunger for resources and fear of overreach. Time itself becomes a character in the story, its passage shaping what choices appear possible, what gambles seem acceptable. Meanwhile, the people of Asia watched as shadows lengthened. In China, villages burned, and resistance fighters dreamed of deliverance that might never come. In India, nationalist leaders watched Britain falter, wondering if the empire's weakness could open the door to independence. Across the Dutch East Indies, whispers spread that a new master might soon arrive, one who spoke of liberation from European rule but brought conquest instead. The tide of empire was shifting, and in the silence left by America's hesitation, Japan's ambitions found more room to breathe. But ambition always walks hand in hand with risk. Each conquest demands occupation, each colony seized requires garrisons, each victory stretches supply lines further. Without Pearl Harbor, Japan might avoid the immediate wrath of the United States, but it might also become trapped in a slow war of attrition in Asia, its armies bogged down in jungles, its resources strained, its people weary. And without the spectacle of Pearl Harbor to unite America, would the United States instead be drawn in gradually, step by step, until war came not as a thunderclap, but as a creeping storm? This possibility paints the Pacific not with fire, but with tension, like the silence before a typhoon when every tree bends in warning. And so Japan stands at the crossroads. One path leads south, into the jungles of Southeast Asia, rich with resources but fraught with danger. Another path leads north, into the snows of Siberia, tempting but treacherous. A third path, less often imagined, leads not to war but to negotiation, a cautious attempt to reach some understanding with America, to restrain the conflict through diplomacy rather than combat. Could Japan have sought compromise, perhaps easing its expansion in exchange for relief from embargoes? Could its leaders, instead of striking with swords, have reached out with words? Such an outcome seems unlikely, for ambition rarely yields. Yet in this world of speculation, even unlikely doors remain open. The rising sun casts long shadows across the Pacific. The harbors are calm, the fleet still watchful, the soldiers still waiting. But each choice Japan makes ripples outward, shaping the lives of millions, shaping the fate of continents. And while Japan debates its path, while Britain holds its breath, while the Soviet Union bleeds, America still waits, its factories silent, its giants slumbering. Yet the silence cannot last forever. Somewhere, some spark will come. The question is not if, but when, and what form it will take. Will it be a creeping expansion southward, a clash in the snows of Siberia, or a confrontation in the Philippines that forces America's hand? The future hangs suspended, like a sword above the stage, ready to fall. While the rising sun casts its glow across Asia, in Europe the nights are long and uncertain. Britain holds out still, battered yet unbroken, but its endurance is not endless. Each raid that strikes its cities leaves scars, not only in stone, but in spirit. And as Churchill paces the cabinet war rooms, his footsteps echoing against the concrete walls, he knows that resolve alone cannot guarantee survival. Britain, without the certainty of American armies to come, finds itself balanced upon a knife's edge, the weight of desperation pressing heavier with each passing month. It is here, in this alternate silence of American hesitation, that we must imagine the possibility of words replacing weapons, of negotiation reaching where bombs cannot. Germany, too, watches carefully. In our history, Hitler dreamed of crushing Britain, but when it became clear that the island would not fall easily, his gaze shifted eastward toward the Soviet Union. Yet in this altered world, with America still slumbering, Germany may find opportunity in diplomacy. For what Hitler truly desired was security in the West, freedom to expand eastward without fear of Britain as a dagger at his back. Could he, sensing Britain's isolation, have extended the hand of negotiation once more? A peace treaty, however cynical, could offer legitimacy to his conquest of Europe, freezing the lines of domination as they stood, and leaving Britain weakened but alive. The thought is unsettling. Imagine the scene. Diplomats seated at a long table in a neutral capital, maps spread across polished wood, pens scratching as borders are redrawn. Britain, weary from bombardment and shortages, agrees to recognize Germany's control of the continent in exchange for guarantees of survival and the preservation of its empire. Germany, in turn, promises not to invade the island, securing its western flank. It would be no peace of equals, but a compromise born of exhaustion. Churchill, in our reality, declared that Britain would never surrender. But if public opinion wavered, if resources ran dry, if a successor less defiant took his place, could the unthinkable have become reality? History rarely moves in absolutes. Even iron wills bend, when the weight of necessity grows too heavy. And what then would the world look like? A Europe divided by treaty lines, with the swastika sanctioned across the continent. France, Poland, the Low Countries all under German rule, legitimized by Britain's acquiescence. The dream of liberation silenced, resistance movements left adrift, without the hope of eventual American landings. Across the Channel, Britain licks its wounds, no longer a beacon of defiance but a weary survivor, its empire intact yet overshadowed. America, still hesitant, might look across the Atlantic and see not a brave ally fighting on, but a partner resigned to compromise. Would that strengthen American reluctance, or would it spark outrage at the thought of Europe carved up without resistance? Yet we must also consider the opposite thread. Perhaps negotiation was impossible, not only because of Churchill's defiance, but because of Hitler's own ambition. His vision of empire was vast and merciless. Could he ever have been satisfied with compromise, or would he always have sought to subjugate Britain outright? In that case, negotiation becomes not a bridge, but a mirage, a fleeting image that dissolves under closer scrutiny. Britain may have been tempted, but Germany's appetite might never have allowed it. Thus, the island stands firm, battered yet stubborn, refusing to bow even as it grows weaker. Still, the mere possibility of negotiation casts a long shadow. It changes the tone of Europe's war. Without America's entry, every bombing raid, every convoy lost, every political debate in London carries with it the whisper of doubt. Is this fight sustainable, or must terms be sought? The German High Command, too, may weigh its options differently. If Britain can be neutralized diplomatically, then more divisions can be poured into the east. The Eastern Front, already a furnace, grows hotter still. Moscow trembles. Stalingrad may never be defended. Leningrad may starve without relief. The fate of Europe rests not only on battlefields, but on words spoken across tables, words that might redraw the map as surely as armies. But there is another layer here, subtler, less visible. Negotiation would not only shape borders, it would shape memories. A Britain that compromised would not stand in the world's imagination as the lonely defender of freedom. Its legend would be different, muted, perhaps even stained with regret. The speeches remembered today, the defiance that inspired generations, might never be spoken. Instead of "we shall fight on the beaches," history might recall weary talks behind closed doors, concessions signed under duress. What would it mean for the post-war world if Britain's role in the war was remembered not for its endurance, but for its capitulation? The moral fabric of the 20th century itself might be woven differently. And yet, history resists finality. Even if negotiation occurred, even if treaties were signed, would they endure? Could Britain truly coexist with a German-dominated Europe? Or would such an arrangement always simmer with tension, waiting for another war to break out? Treaties may quiet guns, but they cannot quiet ambition, nor erase mistrust. Perhaps negotiation would not end the war, but merely pause it, a fragile interlude before new storms broke. And perhaps during that pause, America, still watching, still weighing, would find its position altered. To intervene against Germany after Britain signed peace would be politically difficult. To remain neutral would be dangerous. The United States might turn its attention entirely to the Pacific, to the slow confrontation with Japan, leaving Europe's fate sealed in ink. Imagine, then, the ripple effect. A negotiated peace in Europe allows Germany to consolidate its empire, to pour resources into industry, to train new armies. The Soviet Union, under even greater pressure, might falter sooner. Japan, emboldened, might expand without fear of American reprisal, at least for a time. The world order reshapes itself around America's absence from Europe, Britain's absence from defiance. And in that absence, the shadows lengthen, as if the light of resistance has grown dim. But speculation always opens new doors. Perhaps the very act of negotiation would fracture Britain internally, sparking outrage among its people, leading to unrest, even rebellion. Perhaps the empire would weaken not because of bombs, but because of disillusionment. Colonies might no longer respect the authority of a mother country that bent the knee to Hitler. India, in particular, restless already, might see its chance to push harder for independence. Negotiation, then, might not save Britain, but undermine it, leaving it weaker, its empire crumbling from within. The threads of possibility twist, each one leading to a different image of the future, each one fragile, uncertain, like smoke rising into the night sky. The war in Europe, whether fought or negotiated, remains tied to the question of time. How long can Britain endure? How long can Germany afford to wait? How long before America, for reasons of necessity or morality, steps into the fray? Time stretches, uncertain, each moment heavy with choices unmade. And as we turn our gaze once more, we see that while Britain contemplates negotiation and Germany weighs its ambitions, the Soviet Union continues to bleed, its forests and cities aflame. Negotiation in the West may buy Germany more strength in the East, and the fate of the world may hinge not on Britain's survival, but on whether Stalin's armies can withstand the storm alone. The ink on imagined treaties in Europe is barely dry. The voices of negotiation still echo in hidden corridors when the war in the East grows louder, fiercer, more consuming. For while Britain weighs survival through words, the Soviet Union bleeds in silence, its fate bound not by diplomacy, but by the clash of armies across snowbound fields. Germany, secure in the West, or at least less threatened, pours its strength eastward with renewed fury. Divisions march across the plains, tanks grind through villages reduced to rubble, aircraft scream across the skies, leaving trails of smoke against the pale winter Sunday. In our history, the Soviet Union held through immense sacrifice and the lifeline of American supplies. But here, in this altered world, that lifeline is thin, uncertain, perhaps even absent. The gamble Stalin faces is harsher, the stakes more desperate, the margin of survival razor thin. Picture Moscow in the winter of 1941. Snow drifts against the Kremlin walls, the city shivers beneath its frozen cloak. Soldiers dig trenches in frozen ground, their breath rising in clouds, their hands stiff around rifles. Civilians huddle in basements, clutching one another as the thunder of artillery draws closer. The German armies, though slowed by cold, still press forward. In our timeline, reinforcements, supplies, and the sheer resilience of the Soviet people turn the tide, halting the Germans at the gates of the capital. But without sufficient trucks to move divisions quickly, without warm clothing provided by allies, without aircraft and fuel arriving in convoys, could Moscow have withstood the storm? The Red Army may still fight with courage, but courage alone cannot replace boots, bullets, and bread, and beyond Moscow lies the endless expanse of Russia. Even if the capital fell, Stalin might retreat eastward, shifting his government beyond the Urals, dismantling factories, and rebuilding them in Siberia, as in our history, but without foreign aid to sustain production. Could those factories rise again quickly enough? Could the Soviets relocate entire industries without the steady stream of American machinery and raw materials? The image is uncertain. Perhaps the vastness of Russia itself still acts as a shield, swallowing invaders in its distance, freezing them in its winters. Or perhaps, this time, the shield cracks, and the invaders march farther than ever before, their banners planted not only at Moscow's gates, but on the banks of the Volga, in the heart of Eurasia. The siege of Leningrad, too, takes on darker hues in this alternate world. In our history, supplies trickled in across the frozen road of life, convoys daring the ice to feed the starving city, yet even then, over 1 million perished. Without additional support, without trucks and equipment from abroad, the siege may have ended not in endurance, but in surrender. Imagine Leningrad silent, its people gone, its streets emptied by famine and conquest, its proud spirit extinguished. The fall of such a city would echo across the world, a symbol of Soviet weakness, a beacon of German triumph. And what of Stalingrad, that great turning point of history? In our timeline, it was the graveyard of German ambition, a brutal battle that shattered the illusion of Nazi invincibility. But in this altered thread, without convoys to sustain the Red Army, without the American trucks that ferried men to the front, without the food that kept soldiers standing, perhaps the Soviet resistance at Stalingrad is weaker, the defense shorter, the outcome reversed. Imagine German flags flying over the ruins of Stalingrad, the Volga crossed, the road to the Caucasus open. Oil fields there, rich and vital, fall into German hands, fueling the war machine with fresh reserves. The war in the East shifts, no longer a struggle of attrition but a march of conquest. The thought chills like the wind sweeping across the steppes. Stalin himself becomes a figure of speculation. In our history, he remained unyielding, his grip on power absolute, his will to resist unbroken. But leaders, too, are shaped by circumstance. If Moscow fell, if Leningrad starved, if Stalingrad was lost, could even Stalin contemplate negotiation? Could he, cornered and desperate, seek some kind of arrangement with Hitler, dividing Russia into spheres of influence, preserving his own rule in a diminished state rather than facing annihilation? Such a pact would be monstrous, yet not impossible. The world has seen stranger bargains. The image of Stalin and Hitler, once partners in a cynical alliance in 1939, meeting again to carve up Eurasia, is one that darkens the imagination. In such a world, resistance becomes rebellion, survival becomes compromise, and the war loses its axis of defiance. But perhaps, once again, we must consider the other path. For the Soviet Union was not only a state, it was a people. Vast, resilient, scarred by centuries of hardship. Even without aid, even facing unimaginable losses, could they still endure? Could the will to fight, the sheer stubbornness of survival, carry them through where supplies could not? History has shown that armies collapse when their spirit breaks, but the Soviet spirit was iron. Women worked in fields and factories, children gathered scrap metal, soldiers marched barefoot if they had to. The nation itself became a weapon. In this vision, even without American convoys, even without warm clothes and fuel, the Soviet people bend but do not break, clinging to survival through sheer defiance. Germany may conquer cities, may seize fields, but it cannot extinguish the fire of a people fighting for their very existence. And what of the consequences for the wider world? If the Soviets falter, Britain grows weaker still, left to face a continent dominated by Germany with little hope of relief. If the Soviets endure, the war remains uncertain, a grinding furnace that consumes millions without resolution. America, watching debates endlessly. Some voices demand intervention, warning that if Europe and Asia fall, America will face enemies too powerful to resist later. Others argue that without direct provocation, America should not shed blood for foreign wars. Each day of Soviet survival, or Soviet defeat, sways these debates, shaping the future of American action. The longer America waits, the higher the stakes grow, the more decisive its eventual entry must be. The snow falls, muffling the sound of battle, covering fields where countless soldiers lie. In villages, old women light candles in windows, their flames trembling in the cold air. In trenches, soldiers clutch rifles, their eyes hollow with exhaustion but still alert. The Soviet gamble is not yet decided. It is a game of survival, of will against will, of endurance against ambition. And while the Red Army fights and bleeds, while Britain waits and watches, across the ocean America still hesitates, its factories silent, its people divided. Yet even as the giant sleeps, its shadow stretches, for all know that sooner or later the weight of its decision will fall. The question is whether it will come in time, or whether the world will already have been reshaped by the victories and compromises of others. As we move forward, the silence of America becomes more pressing. The giant does not stir, but its heartbeat can be felt in every debate, every hesitation, every delay. And so we must turn our gaze back across the ocean, to the halls of Congress, to the voice of Roosevelt, to the restless arguments of isolationists and interventionists. For it is in America's inner debate, as much as on any battlefield, that the fate of this alternate world will be decided. Across the Atlantic, where the streets are quieter, where no bombs fall from the night sky, the war is still felt in arguments rather than in ruins. In Washington, the lights of the Capitol burn late, and the chambers of Congress echo with voices rising and clashing. It is here, far from Moscow's snow and London's firestorms, that another battlefield unfolds, the battlefield of opinion, hesitation, and conviction. The United States in this alternate world has not been struck at Pearl Harbor, and so the sense of urgency that united its people in our history does not exist. Instead, the old divisions remain, sharp and unresolved, tugging the nation between duty and reluctance, between global responsibility and the yearning to remain apart. Roosevelt sits at his desk in the Oval Office, his hands clasped, his mind heavy with calculation. He sees the reports. German tanks pressing deeper into Russia, Britain's cities trembling under nightly raids, Japan's maneuvers across Asia. He knows the danger, senses the storm gathering beyond the horizon. But he also hears the voices of his people, voices that remind him of the last war, of sons buried in the fields of France, of promises that America would never again be dragged into Europe's quarrels. Isolationist senators thunder in speeches, declaring that the Atlantic is wide, that the Pacific is vast, that America should not spill its blood for foreign empires. Their words resonate with farmers in Iowa, with shopkeepers in Ohio, with mothers who still wear the grief of 1918. Without the shock of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt cannot silence these voices with a single stroke. He must persuade, gently, slowly, always watching the fragile balance of public opinion. The debate stretches into homes as well as halls. In living rooms, families gather around radios, listening to Roosevelt's fireside chats. His voice is calm, measured, soothing, but the questions remain. Should America fight in Europe when its own shores are safe? Should it confront Japan when negotiation might still be possible? The people feel sympathy for Britain, admiration for its stubborn resistance, pity for the suffering of Russia. Yet sympathy is not the same as commitment. The memory of the Great Depression still lingers. The desire for peace still runs deep. Without a spark, without a wound to awaken anger, many prefer to wait, to watch, to hope the storm will pass them by. In Congress, the divisions sharpen. Isolationists speak of betrayal, accusing Roosevelt of dragging the country toward war through the back door. They warn of entangling alliances, of endless costs, of sons sent to die on distant soil. Interventionists, fewer but more urgent, counter that America cannot remain safe in a world dominated by fascism. They speak of principles, of democracy, of the duty of a great nation to act before it is too late. Each side tugs at the rope of opinion, pulling with passion, yet neither able to win outright. And in this tug-of-war, time stretches, the world burns, and America remains uncertain. Roosevelt himself becomes a figure caught between necessity and hesitation. He knows that war may be inevitable, yet he cannot declare it without the will of his people. He sends aid where he can, weapons to Britain, supplies to Russia, convoys across the Atlantic that risk U-boats lurking beneath the waves. But aid is not the same as armies. Factories hum, but not at full tempo. Soldiers train, but not in the numbers history once demanded. America is preparing for a war it has not yet chosen, a sleepwalker moving toward a destiny it cannot fully see. And Roosevelt waits, hoping for a moment, an incident, that will sway the balance, that will make clear to all that neutrality is no longer an option. Meanwhile, the clock ticks, and hesitation itself becomes dangerous. Each month of delay allows Germany to dig deeper into Russia, to build stronger defenses across Europe. Each moment of waiting allows Japan to strengthen its hold in Asia, to expand its reach without fear of reprisal. America's debates, its reluctance, its caution, create opportunities for others to act boldly. History is rarely kind to hesitation. Yet hesitation is what defines this alternate America, caught between its immense potential and its unwillingness to spend it. And beneath the political struggle lies a deeper question, one that whispers in the hearts of ordinary people. Is America's role to defend itself or to defend the world? Must it act only when directly attacked, or must it intervene to preserve a balance of freedom beyond its shores? This question, so heavy and abstract, becomes the true battlefield of 1941 and 1942 in this timeline. And unlike the clear outcomes of battles fought with guns, the outcome of this debate is harder to predict, shaped by moods, by fears, by speeches on radios and articles in newspapers. It is a battle fought not with weapons, but with words. And yet, words have power. A speech can ignite conviction. A newspaper headline can sway millions. A sinking ship, even without Pearl Harbor, might still rouse anger if it bears American lives. A clash in the Atlantic, a confrontation in the Philippines, an insult too great to ignore any of these could become the spark Roosevelt waits for. The question is not whether America will eventually awaken, but when and at what cost. The longer the delay, the greater the price when it finally acts. In this silence of hesitation, one imagines Roosevelt walking the White House gardens at dusk, his cane tapping softly on the path, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He knows that America cannot remain apart forever. He knows that the world is shrinking, that oceans no longer guarantee safety, yet he also knows that leadership without consent is fragile, that to force the nation into war too soon might break the very unity he needs to sustain it. He is a man bound by democracy, caught between foresight and the will of his people. In this, America's strength becomes its weakness. Its leaders cannot act alone, and its people, divided, make decisive action slow. So, the giant sleeps still, though its eyes are beginning to flutter, its breath deepening, its muscles tensing as if in uneasy dreams. Around the world, others watch. Britain hopes, Russia prays, Germany calculates, Japan waits. Every moment of hesitation ripples outward, shaping choices elsewhere, reshaping the balance of power. And as America debates, the question grows sharper. If the giant does not awaken soon, will there still be a world left for it to save? Beyond America's shores, the storm gathers in Asia. Japan, emboldened by hesitation, sees its opportunity grow. The balance of power in the Pacific shifts with each passing month. And so, as Congress argues and Roosevelt calculates, the tide of empire in Asia continues to rise, threatening to flood lands from Burma to the Dutch East Indies. In the next turning of our story, we must follow that tide to see how the balance of Asia tilts in a world where the United States hesitates, and the rising sun spreads its shadow further across the seas. The debates in Washington echo faintly across the oceans, their sound carried like distant thunder, but in Asia the storm is already breaking. Japan, unchallenged by American fleets at Pearl Harbor, continues to extend its reach, its ambitions rolling outward like a tide at full moon. With Britain strained to its limits and the United States still hesitating, the colonies of Southeast Asia lie exposed, their defenses fragile, their guardians weary. The balance of Asia begins to tilt, the rising sun casting longer shadows across seas and islands, mountains and jungles. It is here, far from the marble halls of Congress, that the absence of American action is felt most immediately, as empires old and new wrestle for survival. Picture the British colony of Malaya, its green plantations stretching toward the horizon, its ports busy with ships carrying rubber and tin. In our world, Japanese soldiers advance swiftly through its jungles, defeating forces unprepared for the speed and ferocity of the assault. But in this altered history, the attack does not begin with Pearl Harbor's thunderclap. It comes instead as a calculated move in a slower game, one colony at a time, one strike carefully measured. Britain, already drained by years of war in Europe, finds itself unable to spare sufficient forces to defend these distant lands. Reinforcements that might once have come across the Atlantic now do not arrive, for America has not yet entered the fight. And so the British soldiers in Malaya, outnumbered and under-equipped, face the rising tide alone. The fall of Singapore, that great fortress of empire, becomes not just a possibility, but an inevitability, its guns silent as the Japanese flag rises over its battered walls. Farther south lie the Dutch East Indies, an archipelago rich in oil, its islands shimmering under the tropical sunday. In our world, Japan coveted this prize, for without oil its engines of war would falter. Here, in a timeline without American intervention, the path to those oil fields is clearer, the obstacles fewer. The Dutch, occupied at home, cannot defend their colonies with strength. Britain is stretched too thin. America protests, perhaps sends warnings, but without Pearl Harbor's fury, its people are not yet ready for war. And so, Japanese forces move swiftly, their ships cutting through the Java Sea, their soldiers landing on beaches, their empire expanding island by island. The oil wells burn and then are seized, feeding the engines of conquest. The empire of the rising sun grows stronger, its ambitions fueled by the very lifeblood of modern war. And yet, expansion always carries risk. The farther Japan reaches, the more it must hold, the more it must supply. Every jungle captured requires garrisons. Every port seized must be defended. The map of Asia becomes a quilt of occupation, its threads stretch thin. Resistance begins to grow, guerrilla fighters in Malaya's forests, underground movements in the Indies, whispers of revolt spreading through villages and towns. Japan claims to liberate Asia from European empires, but its rule soon reveals itself as harsh and uncompromising. The promise of freedom is replaced by the reality of subjugation, and the seeds of resistance are sown deep, though they cannot yet blossom in full while Japan's armies stand strong. To the north, China continues its long agony. For years it has endured invasion, its cities bombed, its people scattered, its armies fractured. Yet even under the weight of occupation, resistance persists, stubborn and unyielding. In our history, China's endurance was bolstered by American aid, by supplies and support that flowed steadily after Pearl Harbor. But in this altered world with America hesitant, those lifelines are fewer, the burden heavier. Chiang Kai-shek's government in Chongqing struggles to hold on, while Mao's communist forces grow in strength in the countryside. Without strong American involvement, the balance within China may shift more quickly, the future of the nation uncertain. Does China fragment further under the strain, or does its suffering only deepen its resolve, ensuring that resistance never dies? The question remains open, like a wound that refuses to heal. Meanwhile, the people of Asia watch the shifting tides with wary eyes. In India, nationalist leaders note Britain's weakness and Japan's advance, wondering if the old empire can still hold its grasp. Could the collapse of Britain's eastern colonies spark a wider unraveling, inspiring movements for independence across the subcontinent? Could the very act of Japanese conquest, though brutal in itself, create opportunities for others to break free of European rule? History rarely unfolds as conquerors intend, and the shadow of empire often conceals the seeds of its own undoing. In this world, too, the collapse of Western colonial power in Asia might hasten the end of empire altogether, though not in the way Britain or Japan imagined. Yet one must not forget the silent observer across the Pacific. America watches as the balance of Asia shifts, its allies weakened, its rivals emboldened. Roosevelt hears reports of Singapore's fall, of Japanese troops in the Indies, of convoys sunk and islands occupied. He knows that each conquest brings Japan closer to the Philippines, closer to American territory, closer to confrontation. And yet without Pearl Harbor, the outrage of the people is muted, the calls for war less urgent. America hesitates still, and in that hesitation, Japan finds room to grow. The Philippines, an American possession, becomes the next question mark. Would Japan strike there even without Pearl Harbor? Or would it pause, content with its southern conquest, testing how far it can advance before America is forced to act? The line between war and peace grows thinner, like ice stretching across a river in early spring, ready to crack with the slightest weight. The Pacific itself becomes a vast stage of tension. Battleships patrol, aircraft carriers maneuver, submarines slip silently beneath the waves. Yet open war has not erupted between Japan and the United States. It is a waiting game, a contest of nerves, each side calculating the other's limits. And as the months pass, the map changes, the balance shifts, but the decisive clash does not yet come. This is the danger of hesitation. It allows others to move, to conquer, to build, until the eventual confrontation becomes larger, bloodier, more unavoidable. The people of Asia feel this most keenly. Farmers in Malaya see new masters arrive. Fishermen in the Indies watch unfamiliar flags rise over their harbors. Families in China bury their dead, uncertain when the killing will end. The world tilts beneath their feet, the tides of empire rising and receding, yet America remains across the ocean, its factories silent, its giants still half asleep. And as Asia bends beneath the weight of conquest, the moral question grows sharper. Can a nation that sees such suffering, that knows such tyranny, remain neutral forever? The tide continues to rise. Its next surge may sweep even further, into Burma, toward India, toward Australia itself. The shadow of empire stretches wide. But in the silence beyond the Pacific, the question lingers. Will America wake before the tide reaches its own shores? And if it does, what will remain of Asia by then? As we turn the page, the rising tide forces us to confront not only the shifting balance of power, but also the deeper moral question that haunts America's hesitation. The question of outrage, of conscience, of whether war can be avoided when the soul demands otherwise. The tide spreads across Asia, flooding jungles and harbors, carrying the banners of a new empire to lands once ruled by Europeans. Yet across the Pacific, in the quiet towns and crowded cities of America, there is no sound of sirens, no sudden wail of grief to pierce the heart. The great moral question hangs in the air, like a bell waiting to be struck. Without Pearl Harbor, without that visceral wound, would the American people ever have accepted war? Sympathy for Britain and pity for China run deep, but sympathy and pity are gentle currents. They move the heart, yes, but do they drive a nation to raise armies, to send sons across oceans, to embrace the vast weight of global conflict? Or, would the absence of outrage leave America drifting, always on the verge of action, but never quite crossing the threshold? In our history, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a lightning bolt. It electrified a divided people, silenced isolationist voices, and filled recruiting stations overnight. Mothers who had prayed for peace steeled themselves for sacrifice. Farmers, teachers, clerks, men from every walk of life stood ready to don uniforms because the war had reached their shores, because their own blood had been spilled. In this alternate world, that lightning never strikes. Instead, the sky is heavy with unbroken clouds, the storm delayed, the air tense but quiet. The debate continues, long and slow, as if the nation itself cannot decide whether to wake or to keep dreaming. Imagine a family gathered in their living room, the radio glowing in the dim light. The announcer speaks of the fall of Singapore, of Japanese soldiers advancing through jungles, of convoys sunk in the Atlantic. The father frowns, the mother sighs, the children glance at one another. They feel concern, even sorrow, but the threat is still distant. No American harbor burns, no American flag has been attacked. The words of isolationist politicians still find purchase in such living rooms. Why send our boys to fight for colonies? Why risk American lives for wars not of our making? The moral clarity of Pearl Harbor is absent, and in its absence, uncertainty reigns. Yet morality is not only forged by direct wounds, it is also shaped by conscience, by the slow recognition of injustice. Could America, watching Britain stand alone, watching Russia drown in blood, watching Asia consumed by conquest, have felt its conscience pricked, even without a direct attack? Roosevelt believed so. He spoke often of the four freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear as universal rights worth defending. Without Pearl Harbor, his words might have carried greater weight, or perhaps less, depending on the mood of his people. Would Americans have been moved by principle alone, or would they have required the sting of fire on their own shores? This question lies at the heart of alternate history, for the answer is never certain. And what of the role of time? Outrage need not come in a single instant. It can grow like a slow fire, sparked by smaller embers. A ship sunk in the Atlantic, its crew lost to German torpedoes, an American citizen killed in a Japanese bombing raid over China, a clash between American and Japanese forces in the Philippines. Each of these could serve as sparks, smaller than Pearl Harbor but capable, over time, of igniting fury. Yet sparks alone may not be enough. Without a single overwhelming shock, public opinion might smolder without ever bursting into flame, leaving the nation half-committed, torn between outrage and reluctance. There is also the question of morality within. Without the unifying outrage of Pearl Harbor, America itself might fracture more deeply. Isolationists and interventionists might grow more bitter, their debates harsher, their divisions more pronounced. Roosevelt might face stronger resistance in Congress, his attempts to expand aid blocked, his warnings dismissed. The moral clarity of unity might never come, replaced instead by the fog of endless argument. A nation divided within itself cannot project unity abroad, and so the hesitation deepens, the silence stretches, the danger grows. Yet perhaps the opposite could occur. Perhaps, without Pearl Harbor, America would have entered the war with greater moral conviction, not as a victim but as a deliberate actor, stepping into the conflict out of principle rather than anger. Such an entry might have been slower, but it might also have carried a different tone, one of deliberate choice rather than forced necessity. Imagine Roosevelt, standing before Congress, not after an attack, but after months of mounting aggression abroad, declaring that the time had come to defend freedom, not because America was struck, but because the world demanded it. Would such a declaration have stirred hearts as deeply, or would it have fallen flat without the visceral image of burning ships? The answer remains uncertain, like a path fading into fog. Morality is also shaped by memory. The First World War lingered in the American mind, not as a triumph, but as a warning. Millions remembered, promises broken, lives lost for little gain, the dream of a lasting peace collapsing into bitterness. That memory acted like a weight, dragging the nation back toward caution, urging it not to repeat the mistakes of the past. Without Pearl Harbor to break that weight, the memory might have prevailed, keeping America anchored in hesitation. Or perhaps the very repetition of history, the sight of Europe again under tyranny, of Asia again consumed by war, might have pushed Americans to act, determined not to watch the same tragedy unfold twice. Memory can restrain, but it can also compel. And so the moral question lingers, unresolved. Without Pearl Harbor, America's path is not written in certainty but in possibility. Outrage may never fully ignite, leaving the nation half awake, its immense power unused until too late. Or outrage may grow slowly, sparked by conscience and smaller provocations, leading to an entry into the war that is more deliberate, more measured, but perhaps less united. The morality of war is never simple, and in this alternate world, it becomes even more complex, tangled in hesitation, shaped by conscience, memory, and fear. The bell of outrage still waits to be struck, its silence heavy, its sound delayed. And while America hesitates, the world continues to burn. Britain struggles in darkness, Russia bleeds in snow, Asia bows under new masters. The question is no longer only when America will act, but whether it will act in time, before the moral cost of hesitation becomes too great to bear. And if Pearl Harbor never comes, what spark, what moment, could finally rouse the sleeping giant to its feet? The answer may lie in the unexpected, in events not yet foreseen. A single ship sunk, a single clash in the Pacific, a single miscalculation by Germany or Japan. Any of these could break the silence, And so we turn now to those possibilities, to the alternative sparks that might have replaced Pearl Harbor as the trigger of America's awakening, each one a different path, each one a different world waiting to unfold. The silence of outrage lingers, the bell unstruck, but history is rarely still for long. If Pearl Harbor never came, then some other spark must lie waiting, hidden in the folds of possibility, ready to flare into light. Wars are often born not only of great decisions, but of small miscalculations, moments when pride, chance, or error pushes nations past hesitation. In the absence of burning ships in Hawaii, what other flames might have drawn the United States from slumber into the fire of global war? The first and most obvious danger lies in the Atlantic. Even before Pearl Harbor, American ships escorted convoys across waters thick with German submarines. The U-boats, like wolves beneath the waves, hunted relentlessly, striking at merchant vessels that carried supplies to Britain. In our history, there were incidents where American ships were attacked, sailors killed, tensions rising. Roosevelt used these events to argue for greater involvement, though they were not yet enough to overcome isolationist voices. But imagine a larger clash, an American destroyer sunk with hundreds of sailors lost, a cruiser torpedoed, its wreckage scattered across the sea. The image of grieving families, the news of sons lost not in some foreign trench, but on the decks of their own navy, might have provided the spark. It would not be Pearl Harbor's sudden thunder, but it would be outrage nonetheless, a slow fire turning grief into anger, hesitation into resolve. There is also the Pacific, where American and Japanese interests were bound to collide sooner or later. The Philippines, still an American possession, lay squarely in the path of Japan's ambitions. If Japan moved south into Malaya and the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines stood as both obstacle and prize. Even without Pearl Harbor, clashes here seem inevitable. A Japanese bombing raid striking an American airfield, a naval skirmish in the waters around Luzon, a convoy seized in disputed seas, any of these could draw blood. Once blood is shed, even reluctantly, the tide of public opinion may turn. America might awaken not through sudden shock, but through the slow accumulation of provocations, each one nudging it closer to war until the line is finally crossed. Another possibility lies in the unpredictable realm of diplomacy. Germany, emboldened by victories in the East, might overstep. Imagine Hitler, seeking to intimidate America, ordering U-boats to target any ship, neutral or not, that approaches Europe, a passenger liner sunk, hundreds of civilians lost, newspapers filled with images of the dead. This, too, could be the spark. The memory of the Lusitania in the First World War still lingered in American minds, a symbol of outrage that helped draw them into that earlier conflict. A similar event in this timeline could serve the same role, a grim echo of the past, shaping the future once again. And yet, sparks do not always come from the battlefield. They can also come from the shifting winds of politics and conscience. Imagine Roosevelt, weary of hesitation, deciding that the time for waiting has ended. Perhaps he uses a smaller provocation, magnifies its meaning, and declares that neutrality is no longer possible. His fireside chats grow sharper, his words heavier, calling not for patience, but for action. He frames the war not as a distant quarrel, but as a moral struggle in which America must choose sides. In this sense, the spark could be not an attack but a speech, not bombs but words, igniting conviction in millions. Yet the risk remains. Would the people follow without the raw wound of Pearl Harbor to guide them? Or would Roosevelt's words fall into the pit of hesitation? We must also imagine the possibility of accident. History is filled with wars born of chance, of mistakes that spiraled into catastrophe. A nervous pilot firing too soon, a submarine misidentifying its target, a ship straying too close to contested waters, any such incident could escalate quickly. In the tense world of 1941, and 1,942, with navies circling each other like wary predators. The smallest spark could ignite a conflagration. The world teetered so precariously that even a misfired torpedo might have changed its course. But what if no spark came? What if America continued to hesitate, its leaders cautious, its people reluctant, its rivals careful not to provoke too far? This possibility is perhaps the most haunting. A war without America, at least for a time, would reshape the entire balance of power. Britain might be forced into negotiation, Russia into collapse, Japan into dominance. The absence of a spark becomes as decisive as its presence, shaping a world where hesitation itself is the greatest actor. The silence stretches, the waiting continues, and in that waiting, the Axis powers grow ever stronger. Sometimes what does not happen matters as much as what does. And yet, the longer America waits, the greater the explosion when it finally awakens. If the spark comes later, whether through a clash at sea, a bombing in the Philippines, or a diplomatic outrage, the war it enters will be larger, darker, more difficult. The cost will be higher, the stakes more severe. Delay may grant America time to prepare, to arm, to build, but it also grants its enemies time to entrench, to conquer, to consolidate. When the spark finally comes, it may ignite not a regional conflict, but a global inferno far harder to extinguish. The question then is not only what the spark might be, but when it would come, and how much of the world would already lie in shadow by the time it struck. Would it be a submarine in the Atlantic, a bombing in the Pacific, a speech in Washington, or a simple accident at sea? Or would hesitation last so long that the spark never came at all, leaving America watching from afar as the world was remade without it? The possibilities branch outward like the limbs of a tree, each one leading to a different forest of outcomes, some darker, some brighter, none certain. And so the silence of Pearl Harbor becomes replaced by the uncertainty of sparks. The giant sleeps still, but around it the world burns, waiting for the moment that will rouse it. Whether that moment comes in fire, in words, in grief, or not at all, will decide the fate of continents. And while America's awakening remains uncertain, Britain still endures under bombs, Russia still bleeds in snow, Asia still bends beneath conquest. In our next turning, we must return to Britain once more, to consider the breaking point of the island nation, whether it holds out forever, or whether the absence of American action pushes it at last to the edge of surrender. The silence of America's awakening lingers unresolved, the sparks uncertain, and so we turn our gaze once more to Britain, the small island that has carried the burden of defiance longer than any other. Here, under skies that rumble nightly, with the drone of bombers, the test of endurance reaches its sharpest edge. Each raid leaves scars, not only in stone, but in spirit. Coventry's ruins lie blackened, London's streets carry the smell of smoke, Liverpool's docks smolder beneath the ashes of warehouses once filled with food and supplies. The people still gather in shelters, still sing songs to keep the night at bay, but behind their voices lies fatigue, a weariness deeper than words. Britain has stood alone for so long, and in this alternate world where America delays, the question grows heavier. How long can the island hold before the weight breaks it? Imagine Churchill, still fierce, still resolute, standing before Parliament, cigar smoke curling around him as he speaks of victory. His words, thunderous in defiance, still stir hearts, but the faces he addresses are lined with exhaustion. Supplies are dwindling. Convoys across the Atlantic grow ever more perilous, with German U-boats prowling like wolves in packs. Every merchant vessel lost means fewer rations, fewer bullets, fewer barrels of oil. Families queue for hours for bread, meat, or sugar, their patience tested as much as their stomachs. In such conditions, resolve begins to wear thin, even in a nation as proud as Britain. The glow of speeches cannot always cover the cold of hunger. And so, whispers begin to surface. Quiet at first, then louder in private circles. Could there be another path? Could negotiation with Germany, unthinkable in the defiant days of 1940, now offer a way to survive? Perhaps not Churchill himself for his soul seemed bound to resistance, but others within government, or among the public, might wonder. After all, Germany already holds the continent. France has fallen. Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands are gone, and Russia struggles in the east. Without America in the war, is it folly to imagine that Britain can stand forever alone? The thought is bitter, like medicine swallowed reluctantly, but bitterness does not erase its logic. Picture, then, a scene in some quiet room in Whitehall, curtains drawn, voices hushed. Advisors speak in cautious tones. Perhaps terms could be found. Perhaps we could preserve the empire if we concede the continent. Better to keep what we have than lose all. Across the channel, Hitler too might calculate. For all his ambition, he feared overstretch. A peace with Britain would free his hands in the east, allowing his armies to focus entirely on Russia. Perhaps he would offer terms that left Britain technically independent, its empire intact, in exchange for recognition of German dominance in Europe. Such a bargain would be cynical, cold, and temporary, but in desperation could it be accepted? The image is unsettling. Britain alive but diminished, its legend of defiance replaced by the memory of compromise. And yet history resists such certainties. For Britain was not only an island of leaders and governments, it was an island of people who had endured the Blitz, who had faced fire from the skies and had not broken. Would such a people accept negotiation, or would they cling to resistance even in the face of despair? The resilience of the British spirit is hard to measure, and perhaps even harder to break. Even in this alternate world, even with America absent, perhaps the people would refuse to bow, their pride stronger than their fear. Perhaps the island would continue to endure, battered but unbent, waiting for some future moment when allies would come. But to endure is not without cost. Each month of bombing wears down factories. Each convoy lost weakens the arsenal. Each raid sows fear. Children evacuated to the countryside grow older under skies of war. Families bury their dead with no certainty that peace will ever come. If resistance endures too long without hope of relief, it risks turning into despair. That despair could manifest in unrest, in protests against rationing, in the collapse of confidence in leadership. Even Churchill, as unshakable as he was, needed the trust of his people to carry on. In this alternate world, that trust may be tested to breaking. Beyond the island itself lies the question of empire. Britain's colonies, already stretched, begin to tremble. In India, nationalist leaders grow louder, pointing to Britain's weakness as proof that independence is not only possible but inevitable. In Africa, in the Middle East, the demands for self-determination grow harder to ignore. The very empire Britain might seek to preserve through negotiation could unravel under the pressure of war and weakness. The attempt to save it might instead hasten its decline. In such a case, negotiation with Germany would not secure survival but merely accelerate disintegration. Still, the possibility of Britain's collapse or its compromise would reshape the war entirely. Imagine Germany, freed from the threat of invasion across the Channel, turning its full attention eastward. Divisions that in our history were held back for defense could instead march into Russia, tipping the balance in battles that were already brutal. The Red Army, bleeding without American aid, would face even greater pressure. The Eastern Front, already a furnace, might consume the Soviets entirely. In this vision, the fall of Britain is not just the end of one island's resistance, but the beginning of an uncontested German empire stretching across Europe and into Asia. Yet the shadow of possibility falls in many directions. Perhaps Britain, rather than negotiating, finds strength in desperation. Perhaps the very thought of compromise stiffens its spine, galvanizing leaders and people alike to endure longer, to resist with even more fury. Perhaps the knowledge that surrender would mean slavery fuels determination beyond what seems possible. History often turns at such moments, when a people decide that suffering is preferable to submission. Britain, even alone, might cling to this defiance, waiting for sparks across the ocean to grow into fire, waiting for America to awaken at last. And so the island stands, its fate uncertain. On some paths it bends, seeking terms. On others it holds, enduring endless nights of fire. In every path the absence of America weighs heavily, like a shadow over the sea. Britain's breaking point is not inevitable, but it is possible. More possible in this world than in the one we know. And whether it breaks or endures, its fate ripples outward, shaping the course of the war, shaping the destiny of nations. As we leave Britain once more, we turn our gaze eastward again, for if the island falters or endures, another empire is rising in the Pacific. Japan, flush with conquests, stands at the height of its power, stretching from the jungles of Burma to the islands of the Indies. And so our story shifts once more to the vision of a Japanese empire triumphant, the rising sun casting its light across Asia, its shadow stretching farther than ever before. The skies over Britain still glow with fire, the island enduring or wavering at the edge of despair, but across the world the sun rises higher, blazing in the east. Japan, unburdened by the catastrophe of Pearl Harbor's retaliation, moves steadily, its banners unfurled across lands that once belonged to others. The map of Asia transforms, the colors of European empire fading like old paint, replaced by the red and white of the rising Sunday. From the forests of Burma to the oil fields of the Indies, from the ports of Hong Kong to the harbors of Manila, the Japanese empire stretches wider than ever before, a vast domain built on ambition and conquest. At its height, it is an empire not of dreams but of iron, its shadow long and heavy upon millions. Imagine the fall of Singapore, once the proud fortress of the British Empire in the East, now reduced to silence as Japanese soldiers march through its streets. The guns that face the sea lie rusting, their barrels turned the wrong way, unable to halt the tide that came through the jungles. The city, long a jewel of empire, bends under a new flag, its people uncertain what tomorrow will bring. Farther south, in the Dutch East Indies, the oil fields blaze and then are seized, their wells guarded by Japanese engineers and soldiers, the lifeblood of industry now flowing into Tokyo's veins. In Burma, Japanese troops march along dusty roads, their presence pressing closer to India's frontier, a signal to Britain's colonies that the empire they once thought eternal is fragile indeed. China, too, feels the full weight of this height. For years it has endured occupation, its cities scarred by bombings, its people scattered. Now, without the steady flow of American aid, without the certainty of a broader Allied front, its struggle becomes even more desperate. Chiang Kai-shek clings to power in Chongqing, his armies stretched thin, while Mao's forces grow in the countryside, feeding on discontent, building strength in shadows. Japanese forces, though strained by years of war, press their advantage, determined to break resistance once and for all. In this alternate world, China risks becoming less a battlefield of resilience and more a graveyard of independence, its fate suspended between rival occupiers and internal divisions. The empire at its height is not merely a matter of borders and conquests. It is also a matter of people. Millions wake each day under the gaze of soldiers in foreign uniforms. In Malaya, farmers who once sold their crops to British merchants now deliver them to Japanese overseers. In the Indies, laborers dig oil wells under stricter orders, their lives spent for fuel that feeds distant war machines. In Burma, families watch columns of soldiers march past, the sound of boots echoing through valleys where once only birds called. The promise of liberation from European empires, whispered in Japanese propaganda, quickly fades into the reality of occupation, of forced labor, of resources drained away. The empire at its height is a vast machine, and those who live within its gears feel the grinding of its demands. Yet empire is never without fragility. Expansion brings wealth but also burden. The Japanese military must garrison vast territories, patrol endless coastlines, feed an army stretched across jungles, mountains, and islands. Resistance movements, though scattered, begin to stir. In Malaya's forests, small bands of fighters harass convoys, ambushing and vanishing like ghosts. In the Philippines, local guerrillas whisper of rebellion, waiting for a chance to strike. In Burma, nationalist leaders wrestle with temptation, some collaborating, others resisting, all aware that foreign rule brings no true freedom. The empire at its height carries within it the seeds of unrest, seeds that may take years to sprout, but sprout they surely will. Still, in this moment of alternate history, Japan stands triumphant. Its empire spans the Pacific and Indian Oceans, its resources flowing, its enemies weakened or hesitant. Germany presses in Europe, Russia bleeds, Britain strains, America waits. For Tokyo's leaders, the dream of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere seems closer to reality than ever. They imagine a vast zone free from Western influence, united under Japanese leadership, rich in resources and bound by force. It is a vision of dominance, a vision that in this timeline is not immediately shattered by American counterattack, but allowed to grow, to take root, to reshape the imagination of Asia itself. And yet the question remains, how long can such a vision last? Empires built on conquest often shine brightest at their zenith, just before decline begins. The farther Japan stretches, the more brittle its grasp becomes. The jungles swallow men, the seas demand ships, the skies require planes that cannot be replaced quickly enough. The people within its borders simmer with resentment, their patience thin, their resistance gathering. Even at its height, the empire trembles beneath the weight of its own ambition. And across the Pacific, the giant still breathes, still prepares, its slumber restless, its factories humming more loudly with each passing month. The empire at its height may be formidable, but its foundations remain vulnerable, fragile beneath the appearance of strength. We must also consider the ripple effects beyond Asia. The fall of European colonies weakens the old empires irreparably. Britain's grip loosens, France's empire in Indochina becomes little more than a memory the Dutch East Indies lost. Even if one day Japan falls, the return of Europe to these lands will not be simple. Independence movements will rise stronger, emboldened by the collapse of colonial authority. Thus, Japan's empire, at its height, though oppressive in its moment, may serve as a catalyst for change long after its banners are torn down. History is full of ironies, and perhaps the greatest irony is that conquest often plants the seeds of freedom in lands once thought bound forever. But in this alternate world, in this moment of height, the vision of Japanese dominance stretches unchallenged. Asia bows under its rule. Britain trembles. Russia endures. America debates. The sun rises higher still, but the question lingers like a shadow beneath its light. Is this height the beginning of permanence, or the prelude to collapse? Can the empire of the rising sun sustain itself without provoking the wrath of the sleeping giant, or is its triumph only an illusion, a crest before the inevitable fall? As we leave this vision of empire at its height, our eyes turn once more to the snowbound east, where the Soviet Union still fights for survival. For even as Japan revels in its triumph, the fate of the world may be decided not in jungles or colonies, but in the frozen streets of Moscow, the ruins of Stalingrad, the endless steppes where millions march and fall. And so we spiral back to the Soviet Union's fate, to the question of whether it bends, breaks, or endures beneath the weight of history. While the rising sun casts its rays across Asia, to the north and west the world lies frozen under different banners. The Soviet Union, vast and scarred, remains the crucible where the war's fate is most severely tested. Germany has pressed deep into its heart, its armies spread across plains and forests, its boots treading through villages reduced to ash. In our history, the Soviets endured through immense sacrifice, their strength bolstered by American convoys that delivered trucks, food, fuel, and weapons across dangerous seas. But in this alternate world, those lifelines are thin, uncertain, often absent. The Soviet Union fights more alone than ever, and its fate hangs in the balance, suspended between collapse and survival. Picture Moscow once more, but this time not only trembling under artillery, but starved of supplies that in another world might have come from across the ocean. Railcars arrive with fewer rations, fewer shells, fewer rifles. Soldiers march in boots worn to tatters, their uniforms patched and inadequate for the biting cold. Tanks stall for lack of spare parts, their hulks abandoned in snow. Yet the German army, too, feels the weight of distance, its own supply lines stretched thin, its soldiers freezing in alien fields. The clash is brutal, each side fighting not only the enemy but the elements themselves. Winter becomes as much a combatant as any general, its icy hand crushing men and machines without discrimination. Could Moscow fall in this altered world? The possibility is more real here than in our history. Without the steady flow of American trucks and locomotives, Soviet mobility suffers, reinforcements delayed, counterattacks less swift. German columns, though weary, may press closer, their banners threatening the Kremlin itself. Imagine the Red Star torn down, the Soviet capital occupied, Stalin forced to retreat eastward into the Urals. Factories dismantled, government relocated, the war continuing, but the heart of the Soviet Union lost. The psychological blow alone might stagger resistance, encouraging collaboration, weakening morale. The fall of Moscow would not necessarily mean defeat, but it would mark a turning point of dreadful weight. And what of Leningrad, already starving under siege? In our history, the city held for nearly 900 days, enduring famine of almost unimaginable scale. With aid reduced, the suffering would be even greater. The road of life across the frozen lake might carry fewer supplies, fewer chances of survival. Perhaps the city does not endure, but falls into silence, its population consumed by hunger, its defenses broken by sheer exhaustion. The fall of Leningrad would echo like thunder across the world, a symbol of Soviet weakness, a triumph of German persistence, a shattering of the illusion that resistance could last forever. Farther south, the city of Stalingrad looms as the great test. In our world, it became the graveyard of German ambition, the turning point of the war. But here, without the constant flow of food, vehicles, and ammunition from America, can the Red Army still hold? Perhaps its defenses crumble sooner, the city falling after weeks instead of months. The Volga crossed, the Caucasus opened, Germany seizing oil fields rich enough to fuel its armies for years. Such a victory would reshape the entire war, giving Hitler the resources he so desperately needed, and leaving the Soviets gasping, their survival more uncertain than ever. The war in the East might then tilt decisively, not toward attrition but conquest, the swastika planted firmly upon the ruins. And yet, collapse is never the only path. The Soviet Union's resilience was not born of supplies alone. It was born of people who refused to yield, of a system brutal yet effective in mobilization, of a land so vast it could absorb defeat after defeat and still fight on. Even without American aid, the Soviets may endure through sheer will. Factories relocated beyond the Urals might still produce tanks and guns, even if more slowly. The Red Army, though battered, may still regroup, learning from its mistakes, adapting, hardening. The winter, though cruel, remains a weapon that Germans cannot master. Perhaps Moscow does not fall. Perhaps Leningrad still endures in hunger. Perhaps Stalingrad still becomes a furnace that consumes both sides, even without American trucks to carry soldiers to the front. History might bend, but resilience may still prevail, bending back against the storm. If the Soviets survive without America, the consequences are profound. Their eventual victory would be remembered not as a shared triumph, but as an even more solitary one, forged in blood and deprivation. Their sense of pride, of sacrifice unmatched, would be magnified. The post-war world might then tilt even more heavily towards Soviet influence, for they could claim with greater legitimacy that they bore the war's heaviest burden alone. Without American presence on European battlefields, without D-Day, the Soviet flag might fly over far more of Europe when the war finally ends. A darker Iron Curtain could descend, stretching not from Berlin to Warsaw, but perhaps deeper into the continent, perhaps even into lands Britain once hoped to defend. But what if survival's not enough? What if Stalin, faced with catastrophe, chooses a path of pragmatism rather than defiance? The thought is chilling, yet possible. In 1939, he signed a pact with Hitler, dividing Eastern Europe between them. Could he, in desperation, seek another arrangement? If Moscow falls, if Leningrad starves, if Stalingrad burns, might Stalin seek terms to preserve his rule in the East, ceding the West to Germany in exchange for survival beyond the Urals? Such a pact would be monstrous. A betrayal of all sacrifices made, yet desperation breeds dark bargains. In that world, Eurasia might be divided between two tyrannies, Nazi and Soviet, their uneasy alliance dominating half the globe. The dream of liberation in Europe would vanish, and America, still hesitant, would face a future where its rivals were far stronger than it could imagine. The fate of the Soviet Union, then, branches like a tree under snow. One branch breaks under the weight, cities falling, resistance crushed, the war lost. Another bends but holds, survival secured through endurance, victory delayed but eventual, the world reshaped by Soviet triumph. A third twists into a darker shape, a bargain struck, a map redrawn through compromise rather than conquest. Each branch leads to a different future, and in each one, America's absence is decisive, its hesitation magnifying the stakes, shaping outcomes through silence. And still, through all possibilities, the Soviet people endure. Soldiers crouch in trenches, their breath freezing in the air. Women labor in factories, their hands cracked by cold, their backs bent in exhaustion. Children scavenge in ruins, their eyes wide, their futures uncertain. The Soviet Union at war is not only a nation but a vast landscape of suffering and defiance, a story of millions whose lives intertwine with the choices of leaders and the movements of armies. Whether they collapse, endure, or bargain, their sacrifices remain, their stories woven into the fabric of this alternate world. As the snow falls over Russia, the silence of America echoes louder still. The fate of the Soviet Union cannot be separated from the question of whether the arsenal of democracy will ever awaken. And so our spiral returns westward again, across the ocean, to those silent factories, to that restless giant. For even as Russia bleeds, America's potential remains vast, slumbering, waiting. And in our next turn, we must consider what happens when that potential lies dormant for too long, when the arsenal of democracy remains a dream, and the giant does not yet rise to its full height. The snow falls on Russia, heavy and unrelenting, but across the ocean another silence endures, one not of blizzards but of idling machines. America's factories, those vast cathedrals of industry, remain half awake in this alternate world. In our history, the roar of production after Pearl Harbor was immediate, unstoppable, as if the nation itself had been transformed overnight into an arsenal of democracy. Ships rolled from shipyards in numbers that dwarfed imagination, planes lifted from assembly lines like flocks of steel birds, tanks and trucks poured from factories until the world's balance tipped beneath their weight. But here, in a world without Pearl Harbor, that roar does not come. The giant still stirs, but slowly, uneasily, its power dormant, its potential waiting. And in that waiting lies a different story of war. Imagine the assembly lines of Detroit, their lights dimmed, their workers still building cars for families instead of tanks for armies. The forges that, in our history, hammered steel for Liberty ships now turn more slowly, their full tempo not yet demanded. Aircraft plants stand ready, but the orders that would have unleashed their flood are hesitant, delayed by politics and divided opinion. America is preparing, yes, but cautiously, as if unsure whether the storm will reach its shores. The result is a nation half-armed, its strength immense but unrealized, its promise deferred. Factories, like soldiers, cannot remain idle forever, but the choice to awaken them fully belongs to politics, not necessity. Without Pearl Harbor's fire, the command to rouse them is still locked in debate. This dormancy reshapes the war. In Britain, convoys receive fewer supplies. Shelves that once might have been filled with American food remain sparse. The trucks that would have carried Soviet armies to the front are not built in such numbers. The locomotives that might have transported them never sent. The skies over Europe are emptier, for the swarms of American bombers have not yet been unleashed. Germany feels pressure, but not the overwhelming weight of American industry bearing down upon it. Japan, too, enjoys longer respite, its conquests consolidating before American production can challenge them. The absence of the arsenal is not merely silence, it is opportunity for others. And yet America is not without motion. Roosevelt pushes, as he always did, for preparedness, for some measure of production. Aid continues, though smaller, slower. Factories do shift gradually, building more weapons, more planes, though never at the fevered pitch of a fully awakened nation. Workers begin to feel the change, women taking jobs in plants, farmers sending their sons to training camps, but the scale is muted, the transformation incomplete. America in this alternate world is like a great engine idling, its pistons moving, its fuel ready, but the gears not yet engaged in full. The question is how long such idleness can endure before necessity or catastrophe forces the throttle forward. There is irony in this hesitation, for in the very act of waiting, America may strengthen itself. Each month of dormancy allows more time for retooling, more time for training, more time for stockpiling resources. When the moment of awakening finally comes, whether through provocation, principle, or accident, the flood might be even greater, the arsenal even more unstoppable. But the cost of delay is that by then, the world may already have changed, enemies stronger, allies weaker, battles lost that cannot be reclaimed. Dormancy gives strength to America, but time to the Axis. It is a balance, as delicate as glass, fragile in its tension. Meanwhile, within the nation, the dormancy is not only mechanical but moral. Workers feel pride in building for Britain and Russia, but without open war, the sense of urgency is less. Families still buy new cars, radios, appliances, enjoying the comforts of peace, while others across the ocean burn. The economy recovers, but not yet transformed into a war machine. Soldiers drill on training grounds, but many still doubt whether they will ever be sent abroad. The arsenal of democracy is a phrase, a promise, but not yet a reality. And promises, when delayed too long, risk becoming illusions. Still, Roosevelt knows the power that lies dormant. He knows that if unleashed, America's factories can overwhelm any rival, drown the world in steel and fire, tip the balance of war as decisively as any army. He knows, too, that the decision cannot be postponed forever. Every convoy sunk, every colony seized, every city bombed makes delay more dangerous. He waits for the moment that will break the hesitation, that will awaken his people fully. But as he waits, the enemy builds, the enemy consolidates, the enemy advances. Time, once more, becomes the decisive weapon. And what of the workers themselves? The men and women who in another world became the symbols of wartime effort, Rosie the Riveter, the welders of ships, the machinists of engines. In this alternate history, their songs of labor are softer, their contributions slower. They may still rise eventually, still fill factories with the clang of hammers and the hiss of welders, but for now their days pass with less urgency, their nights without the exhaustion of ceaseless shifts. Lives remain closer to peace than war, but in that peace lies danger, for the world beyond America's shores does not rest. The contrast is stark. While Russian peasants labor in frozen fields to feed armies, while Chinese villagers flee from bombers, while British families huddle in shelters, American families gather in diners, their children playing under neon lights. The dissonance between worlds grows sharper, the gap between potential and reality wider. The image of a sleeping giant becomes sharper here. It is not the slumber of ignorance, but the slumber of hesitation, of a giant lying with one eye half open, aware but unwilling to rise. Its strength fills the air like the sound of distant thunder, but the storm does not break. And in that pause, the world holds its breath. Will the giant awaken too late, its strength arriving only after allies have fallen? Or will its delayed awakening be even more decisive, sweeping aside enemies with a flood they cannot withstand? The future bends around this question, its answer unwritten. And so we see that the dormancy of America's factories is not simply a matter of steel and gears, it is a matter of destiny. The arsenal of democracy, in waiting, reshapes the war as surely as it would in action. The hesitation of one nation magnifies the burdens of others, alters the balance of continents, decides the fate of millions. For every tank not built, a Soviet soldier walks farther on foot. For every ship not launched, a British convoy sinks. For every bomber not assembled, a German city burns unchecked. The absence of production becomes as decisive as its presence. But war is not only about nations and factories. It is also about people, about families whose lives are shaped by the choices of leaders and the silence of events. And so, as the giant sleeps, as factories wait, we must pause to look closer at the human layer, the soldiers not drafted, the families not torn apart, the children who live different lives in this world where America hesitates. For beneath the strategies of leaders and the maps of empires lies the heart of war, the lives of ordinary people caught in the tide of history. The machines remain quiet, the arsenals only half awake, but history is not written in steel alone. It is written in lives, in the footsteps of soldiers, in the silences of families, in the choices of men and women caught between peace and war. In our history, America's entry into the war changed millions of lives overnight. Boys from farms and cities alike found themselves in uniform, shipped across oceans to fight on beaches and battlefields they had never seen on a map. Women entered factories, welding steel, riveting wings, carrying the nation on their shoulders as men fought abroad. Families rationed food, collected scrap metal, planted victory gardens. The war was total, touching every home, every street, every memory. But in this alternate world, without Pearl Harbor, those transformations arrive more slowly, or perhaps never at all. The human layer of history shifts in quiet ways, subtle but profound. Imagine a boy in Kansas, 17 in 1942. In our world, he might have enlisted the moment he turned 18, carried by the wave of patriotic urgency after Pearl Harbor. He would have sailed to England, marched through France, perhaps fallen on the beaches of Normandy, but here, in this alternate silence, he remains at home. He drives a tractor, helps his father harvest wheat, dreams of the wider world but never sees it. His life unfolds in peace, though peace shadowed by uncertainty, by news of distant battles fought by others. His name will never be etched on a memorial wall, his story never tied to the great struggle of his generation. And yet, his absence from the battlefield changes more than his own life. It changes the weight of war itself, the absence of thousands like him, leaving allies weaker, enemies stronger. Imagine, too, a young woman in Detroit. In our world, she might have donned overalls, tied her hair with a scarf, and joined millions of others on the factory floor. Her hands blistered from welding, her body tired from endless shifts. She might have been one of the symbols of America's transformation, Rosie the Riveter in flesh and blood. But here, with production muted, her path is different. She continues in her old job, perhaps as a secretary, perhaps in a shop. She does not hear the roar of factory floors, does not feel the pride of building ships that carry soldiers, planes that strike enemies. Her life is more comfortable, perhaps, less scarred by fatigue, but also less bound to the epic memory of sacrifice. In this silence, the rhythm of her life remains ordinary, while the extraordinary passes her by. For every soldier not drafted, for every worker not transformed, for every family not touched by war, the human story bends. The war abroad rages, but America at home remains more like the country of the 1930s, still marked by the Depression, still cautious, still waiting. Children grow up without fathers gone to war. Wives do not carry the burden of telegrams telling of death overseas. Communities are not reshaped by the absence of their sons. There is less grief, less sacrifice, but also less unity, less shared purpose, less of the forging of a national identity through common struggle. The greatest generation may not be forged at all, or at least not in the same way. Yet the war does not leave the human layer untouched. News still arrives by radio. Headlines still speak of bombings and invasions. Families still listen, still care, still argue over whether America should act. The moral burden weighs heavy even without direct involvement. Children hear their parents debate at dinner tables, voices raised over whether America should send its boys to Europe, whether it should risk war with Japan. The sense of uncertainty, of waiting, shapes their memories just as powerfully as war itself might have. Instead of stories of heroism, they inherit stories of hesitation, of choices deferred, of a nation watching the world burn from across the sea. And beyond America, the human layer takes on different shades. In Britain, families grow more weary, their sacrifices stretched longer, their hopes thinner. Children raised in bomb shelters grow into teenagers, without knowing peace. Mothers bury sons lost not only to battle but to malnutrition, to despair. In Russia, families endure the unimaginable, fathers gone to the front, mothers plowing fields, children scavenging through ruins. Without American aid, their suffering deepens. Famine stretches further, winters bite harder, lives end sooner. The Soviet people, already burdened with the heaviest weight, carry even more. And in Asia, under Japanese rule, millions wake each day to new masters, their lives reshaped by occupation. Farmers give grain not to their neighbors but to soldiers. Villages are burned in reprisals. Families vanish into forced labor camps. For them, the human layer is not silence but shadow, not hesitation but domination. Thus we see how the absence of America in war reshapes lives not only within its own borders, but across the world. Each life not drafted, each factory not transformed, each family not burdened, alters the rhythm of history. Some lives are spared suffering, others endure even more. The balance of grief shifts, the geography of sacrifice changes, and yet, in every country, lives unfold as they must, shaped by choices beyond their control. History has always lived at the human scale, even when nations speak in millions and maps speak in empires. But there is another dimension to consider. What happens to the memory of a generation that does not fight? In our world, the veterans of the Second World War carried with them stories of Normandy, of Iwo Jima, of the Bulge. They returned with scars, with pride, with sorrow, shaping the culture of America for decades. Without that war, or with a delayed and diminished role, the culture that follows is different. The novels unwritten, the monuments unbuilt, the memories unshared, all these become absences, holes in the fabric of history. The identity of a nation shifts subtly, perhaps becoming less defined by sacrifice, more by caution, by patience, by hesitation. The world remembers differently, because the people live differently. And yet, the human layer also reminds us of resilience. Families adapt, communities endure, children grow into adults regardless of whether their lives are touched by war. Ordinary life, even in extraordinary times, persists. In small towns, in cities, in villages across continents, people still fall in love, still sing songs, still dream of futures. History may bend around them, but within their own lives, the threads of continuity remain. The war reshapes, but it does not erase. Thus we spiral outward again. From the silent factories of America to the quiet lives of its people, from the weary families of Britain to the starving villages of Russia, from the occupied fields of Asia to the dreaming children of every nation, The human layer reminds us that history is not only battles and treaties, but also the simple question of how people lived, suffered, and endured. And as we move forward, we must widen the lens once more to see not only the lives lived during the war, but the world that might emerge afterward. For in this alternate history, the long game stretches into the 1950s, into an age where the axis might endure, where empires might shift, where the balance of the future itself hangs uncertain. The war rages on, battles fought in snow and jungle, skies filled with bombers, seas with submarines. Yet already the shadow of the future stretches beyond the battlefield, reaching into the decades to come. For war is never only about the present moment, it is also about the world that follows, the long game played in treaties, in borders, in the memories of those who survive. In our history, the 1950s dawned, with America ascendant, Europe rebuilding under the Marshall Plan, Asia caught between recovery and revolution. But in this alternate world, where Pearl Harbor never came, where America delayed, where the Axis had more time to entrench, the long game bends into unfamiliar shapes. The world of the 1950s is not the one we know, but one scarred differently, ordered differently, a stranger reflection of our own. Imagine Europe first. If Britain endured through sheer resilience but without decisive American intervention, its strength would be hollowed, its empire weakened, its people weary. Germany, whether through conquest or negotiation, would dominate the continent. Its armies might have planted banners from the Atlantic to the Volga, its industries fed by conquered resources, its power consolidated by treaties signed under duress. Even if the war dragged on, the absence of an early American front would leave Germany stronger for longer, its grip on Europe tighter, its ideology more entrenched. By the 1950s, one could envision a Europe not liberated but divided, with fascist regimes aligned under Berlin's watch, their streets lined with symbols of permanence rather than defeat. Now picture Asia, where Japan's empire at its height spreads wide. With Malaya, Singapore, the Indies, and Burma in its grasp, with China still bleeding, Japan in this alternate 1950s might appear not as a defeated nation rebuilding under occupation, but as an imperial power still ruling vast territories. The Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, once propaganda, could in this reality become a grim fact, its subjects bound by force, its resources feeding Japanese industry. Though resistance would simmer guerrillas in jungles, underground movements in cities, Japan's dominance might endure into the new decade, reshaping Asia not as a place of independence movements emerging under Allied encouragement, but as a continent struggling beneath a different master. The colonial order would not return as it did in our history, but neither would freedom arrive so quickly. The age of empires might linger longer, though under new flags. And what of the Soviet Union? Its fate is the pivot of this entire alternate world. If it collapsed under German pressure, the 1950s might dawn with Russia fragmented, its lands partitioned between occupier and puppet regimes, its people enduring a long winter of defeat. If it survived, barely, through endurance and blood, then by the 1950s, it might emerge as even more defiant, claiming the mantle of victory more exclusively, pressing its influence across Eastern Europe with no American presence to balance it. Imagine a Soviet bloc stretching wider, or a Germany entrenched deeper. Both possibilities leave the continent transformed. The Cold War, if it comes at all, twisted into unfamiliar shapes. The Iron Curtain might fall sooner and harder, or not at all, if compromise silenced the very idea of resistance. Now, turn back to America, the sleeping giant that in our world awoke to reshape the mid-century. In this timeline, the giant may awaken later, perhaps not until provoked by smaller sparks, or perhaps only when the world has already been remade by Axis victories. By the 1950s, America may find itself facing a world less receptive to its influence. Europe, no longer in need of liberation, might be dominated by fascist regimes that resist American ideals. Asia, reshaped by Japanese power, might see independence movements crushed or delayed. America itself, prosperous at home, would still be powerful, its factories immense, its population strong, but its role in the global order diminished, its influence limited by its hesitation. The age of American leadership might arrive later, weaker, or not at all. This alternate 1950s raises haunting questions. What does the world look like when democracy has not been championed by the arsenal of democracy, when freedom has not been secured by the sacrifices of millions of American soldiers? Do we see a world where authoritarian regimes define the order, where the 20th century is remembered not as the triumph of liberty, but as the endurance of tyranny? Or do we see a world where resistance movements, though unsupported, eventually carve their own paths, where independence arrives later but more fiercely, where nations long under occupation rise with even greater determination? History does not vanish, but it reshapes itself, curling into different spirals, carrying consequences far beyond the war itself. And what of the everyday life of the 1950s in this world? In America, suburbs still grow, cars still roll off assembly lines, families still watch the glow of new televisions. But the cultural fabric is different. There are fewer veterans with medals in drawers, fewer war stories told at dinner tables, fewer scars that remind a generation of shared sacrifice. The mythology of unity that bound America in our timeline may never take root in the same way. Instead, the culture may remember the 1940s as a decade of hesitation, of prosperity at home while others bled abroad, of debates unresolved. That memory would shape politics, literature, art, a quieter, less triumphant narrative, more uncertain, more haunted by what might have been. In Europe and Asia, daily life would be darker. Families live under authoritarian regimes, their children raised beneath banners they did not choose. Propaganda fills classrooms. Conformity replaces freedom. Silence becomes survival. In Asia's villages, occupation continues. The dream of independence delayed, the weight of empire heavier still. In Russia, if it endured, the memory of suffering without American aid would deepen mistrust, make the Soviet people even more insular, even more convinced that they alone carried the burden of the world. The Cold War, if it comes, would not be a duel of equals, but a contest between America's late awakening and regimes already deeply entrenched. And yet, even in this darker vision, the seeds of change remain. Tyranny breeds resistance. Occupation breeds rebellion. Silence breeds voices that cannot be silenced forever. The 1950s in this alternate world might not be the dawn of American leadership, but it might be the slow stirring of other forces, the rise of movements from below, the beginning of struggles that would one day break the grip of empires, fascist or otherwise. History, even when delayed, carries with it the inevitability of change. Thus the long game stretches before us, its lines uncertain, its branches many, a Europe under Germany, an Asia under Japan, a Soviet Union either broken or defiant, an America hesitant or diminish. The world of the 1950s becomes unrecognizable, its balance fragile, its future ominous. And yet within that vision lies the seed of later conflict. For if America delays too long, if the Axis endures into a new decade, then when confrontation finally comes, it will not be the Second World War we know, but something larger, darker, more dangerous, a war fought against empires more entrenched, with weapons more advanced, and with stakes that stretch beyond survival into the very shape of the future. And so we must ask, does hesitation prevent war, or merely postpone it? Does America's silence in the 1940s lead to peace in the 1950s, or to a greater war in the decades to follow? To answer, we must look further still, beyond the long game, into the possibility of later conflict, into the haunting prospect that even if the guns fall silent for a time, the embers of war smolder, waiting for a generation yet unborn to breathe them into flame. The world of the 1950s in this alternate history is not one of triumph, but of uneasy stillness, a globe held together by treaties, occupations, and compromises, fragile as glass stretched too thin. Germany entrenched in Europe, Japan dominant in Asia, the Soviet Union either bowed or brooding, and America powerful yet hesitant, standing apart. It is a world balanced, not on harmony, but on delay, a world where war has not vanished, but only shifted its shape, waiting in the silence. And in that silence grows the most haunting question of all. If America's hesitation prevented its full entry into the Second World War, does it merely postpone conflict, leaving its children to inherit not peace but a greater storm? Could the war we know as the Second instead become the seedbed of a third, larger, more catastrophic war born in the middle of the century? Imagine the map by 1955. Europe remains under the swastika, Berlin, its capital of empire, its banners still fluttering across occupied capitals. The German war machine, though weary, has had years to consolidate, to turn conquered lands into satellites, to build new industries from stolen resources, to mold populations under endless propaganda. In Asia, the rising sun has not yet set. Japan, though strained, still rules its vast sphere, its armies garrisoning from Burma to the Indies, its fleets patrolling the Pacific. The Soviet Union, depending on which path we imagine, either endures as a defiant fortress beyond the Urals, or lies broken, its western lands divided, its eastern lands smoldering under occupation or uneasy truces. And in this world, America faces not rivals weakened by defeat, but adversaries entrenched by victory, their power built over decades. The stage is set not for relief, but for escalation. Consider first the military dimension. In our timeline, the Second World War ended before nuclear weapons spread widely, before jet fighters became the norm, before missiles filled arsenals. But in this alternate 1950s, time has passed without decisive victory, and technology has marched on under the banners of different empires. Germany, with its scientists and its resources, might have developed long-range rockets far earlier, weapons capable of striking London, perhaps even across the Atlantic. Japan, with its vast access to oil and labor, might have pressed further into naval aviation or even early missile designs. If the war stretches into these years, or if a new conflict ignites after a temporary peace, it may be fought not with tanks on beaches, but with weapons of terrifying scale, weapons whose shadows darken entire cities. America, too, would not remain idle. Even in hesitation, its scientific brilliance, its industrial might would continue to advance. If provoked later, if drawn into war in the 1950s or 1960s, rather than the 1940s, the giant might unleash not only tanks and planes, but nuclear fire. The first bombs, dropped in our history on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, might instead fall on Berlin, on Tokyo, on Moscow, or on other cities altogether, depending on alliances and outcomes. The Third World War, born of hesitation, could begin with atomic blasts, its opening chords louder and deadlier than any symphony of the past. In this world, delay does not prevent catastrophe, it multiplies its scale. But war is never only about weapons. It is about people, about nations and their choices. Imagine generations of Americans growing up in a world where fascist flags dominate Europe and Asia, where freedom seems always embattled abroad. The memory of hesitation might turn into bitterness, pushing a new generation toward conflict with even greater zeal. Or perhaps the opposite occurs. A culture accustomed to peace, wary of foreign entanglements, resists war even longer, leaving adversaries more time to prepare. Either way, tension builds, like pressure beneath the earth, waiting for the quake. And when it comes, it will not be the controlled eruption of 1941, but a rupture deeper, more violent, more destructive. We must also imagine the psychological weight of delay. For Britain, if forced into negotiation, its pride wounded, its empire weakened, resentment may simmer for decades. The British people, who once saw themselves as defiant defenders, may instead see themselves as survivors of compromise, their history tinged with bitterness. For Russia, if it endured alone, the memory of sacrifice without American aid may forge mistrust so deep it shapes an entire century. If it collapsed, the memory of defeat under German boots may linger like a scar, feeding rebellion in secret, waiting to ignite. For Asia, occupied under Japan's rule, the desire for freedom only grows stronger, every village whispering rebellion, every generation waiting for a chance to rise. These tensions cannot be suppressed forever. If they are not resolved in the 1940s, they will explode later, perhaps in the 1950s or 1960s, in wars not of resistance but of revolution, of nations reclaiming their destinies. And what of Germany and Japan themselves, rulers of vast empires? History shows that conquerors rarely rest. Having secured dominance, they would inevitably seek more, pressing borders, testing rivals, seeking resources, demanding submission. Germany might turn its eyes toward the Middle East, toward oil fields not yet in its grasp, toward Africa still contested. Japan might press farther into the Pacific, its fleets probing ever closer to American shores. Even without Pearl Harbor, confrontation is inevitable. For empires hungry for expansion cannot coexist peacefully with a giant as vast as America, even if it hesitates. Delay only ensures that when confrontation comes, it will be at a time when both sides are stronger, their weapons deadlier, their stakes greater. This is the haunting possibility of a third world war, born not of immediate outrage, but of prolonged hesitation. In our history, the Second World War ended with clarity, with victory, with defeat. In this alternate path, the lines blur, the conflicts stretch, the outcomes are uncertain. The 1950s may dawn not with rebuilding, but with preparations for the next great clash. The world caught in a cycle of unfinished wars, unresolved tensions, and postponed reckonings. The silence of Pearl Harbor becomes not the absence of war, but the shifting of war into a later age, an age more dangerous, more unpredictable, more destructive. And yet, within this vision, we must also see possibility. Delay may give rise to catastrophe, but it may also give rise to endurance. Perhaps America, awakened later, enters the struggle with overwhelming strength, ending it more decisively than ever. Perhaps resistance movements in Europe and Asia grow so strong that they rise without American aid, toppling tyrannies from within, reshaping the world not through foreign armies, but through local revolutions. Perhaps the Soviet Union, whether broken or defiant, becomes the true counterweight to fascism, its survival ensuring that the Axis never enjoys full security. Delay, after all, is not destiny, it is possibility, a branching path whose ends remain unknown. The vision of a third world war, then, is not certain but possible, a shadow cast by hesitation, an echo of battles delayed but not avoided. It looms as both warning and question. Does postponement preserve peace, or does it only sharpen the blade for a strike yet to come? The answer lies not only in strategy but in science, for the 1950s and 1960s are not only decades of politics, they are decades of invention, of technology that reshapes the very meaning of war. And so, as we spiral further outward, we must now turn to that realm, the world of science and technology, of weapons and discoveries, of what changes when America hesitates, and the race for innovation unfolds under different masters. The vision of later conflict lingers like a storm cloud over the horizon, its shape uncertain, its thunder not yet heard. But before storms break, winds shift, And in those wins we find the power of invention. For war is never only fought with soldiers and generals, it is also fought with tools, with machines, with ideas born in laboratories and tested on battlefields. In our history, the Second World War was a crucible of technology, radar, guiding planes through night skies, rockets streaking upward from German launch sites, jet engines transforming speed, and above all, the atom split, its terrible fire unleashed in 1945, but in this alternate path, where America delays, where the axis consolidates, where timelines stretch and choices diverge, the trajectory of science bends differently, the inventions still come, for necessity demands them, but they emerge under new masters, at new times, reshaping the future in ways both subtle and immense. Consider first the rocket. In our world, German engineers pioneered the V2, a weapon ahead of its time, a missile that leapt beyond the boundaries of conventional artillery. It was a harbinger of the space age, born in war but destined to carry humanity to the stars. In this alternate timeline, with Germany stronger and longer entrenched, such projects may be pursued with greater vigor, their resources drawn not from a collapsing regime, but from a dominant empire. Imagine the 1950s not as the dawn of American rockets, but as an age where Berlin boasts of missiles that can cross continents, where the Reich proclaims itself master not only of Europe, but of the skies. The space race may not begin with Sputnik launched from Baikonur, but with a German satellite rising into orbit, its shadow crossing oceans, a signal that technology has been claimed by tyranny rather than freedom. Now picture the atom. In our world, the Manhattan Project was fueled by urgency, by the fear that Germany might reach the bomb first. Scientists gathered in secrecy, their work vast, their achievements staggering. In this alternate history, without Pearl Harbor's shock to ignite urgency, perhaps that project is slower to begin, its funding more hesitant, its purpose less clear. Meanwhile, Germany, secure in Europe, pours its own resources into nuclear research, perhaps making strides once thought impossible. The first atomic test might not flash across the New Mexico desert, but in some remote corner of Europe or Asia, announced by Axis leaders as proof of their supremacy. Imagine the terror if the mushroom cloud rose not as a symbol of American power, but as a weapon in Hitler's or Tokyo's hands. The balance of the future would shift in an instant. The age of nuclear fire beginning under different banners, its consequences far darker. Technology, however, is not only about weapons. It is also about tools of survival and communication. Radar, which in our history guided Britain's defenses, might in this world be improved and expanded by Germany, whose scientists already pursued it with vigor. Jet engines, which emerge late in our timeline, might be perfected sooner by regimes that had more time to consolidate their industries without American pressure. German jets might rule the skies of Europe, Japanese carriers might launch aircraft faster and farther than ever before, their superiority extending years into the future. By the time America fully awakens, the skies may already be dominated by faster, deadlier machines, the balance tilted not by numbers but by innovation seized early. And yet, America's delay is not only a disadvantage. Hesitation gives time, and time can be used for preparation. Even without war, American laboratories hum, universities explore, industries experiment. Inventions that in our world were accelerated by necessity may in this world be pursued by curiosity, their pace slower, but their foundations deeper. When America finally does awaken, it may bring not rushed prototypes, but perfected machines, not hurried projects, but refined breakthroughs. The timing of technology, then, becomes a spiral of irony. Axis powers advancing through urgency, America building through patience. The race unfolding differently but no less decisively. Science also shapes the human layer. In Asia, Japanese occupation might pursue technologies of control propaganda, communications, methods of surveillance designed to keep vast populations subdued. In Europe, Germany might invest in systems of organization, transportation, and even early computing, all to manage its empire more efficiently. These inventions, though born of oppression, might still ripple into the future, their civilian uses discovered only later, their origins buried in darker histories. The world of the 1950s and 1960s might therefore be more technologically advanced yet more morally compromised, its progress entwined with conquest rather than liberation. We must also imagine the cultural consequences of altered invention. The atomic bomb, in our history, became a symbol of American power and responsibility, its use both victory and warning. In this alternate world, if the bomb belongs to others first, America's cultural memory shifts. Instead of seeing itself as the steward of terrible power, it may see itself as the vulnerable one, the nation threatened rather than the nation that threatens. The Cold War, if it comes, would not be one of equals, but one where America begins at a disadvantage, always playing catch-up to powers that seized innovation earlier. The psychology of a nation shapes its choices, and a humbled America might approach the world more cautiously, or more desperately, its identity reshaped by the shadow of missed opportunity. And yet, as with every layer of speculation, the opposite possibility remains. Perhaps even without Pearl Harbor, America's scientific momentum carries it forward. Perhaps its universities, its inventors, its restless curiosity drive breakthroughs regardless of politics. Perhaps the Manhattan Project still unfolds, though slower, and still delivers the bomb before others. Perhaps American rockets still rise, its jets still roar, its computers still hum. Delay does not erase destiny, it only reshapes its path, its timing, its meaning. The question is not whether invention comes, but under whose banner it arrives, and how it is remembered by those who live in its shadow. The world of science in this alternate history becomes a mirror distorted. Rockets rise, but perhaps from different launch sites. Atoms split, but perhaps under darker banners. Radios broadcast, but perhaps in languages of propaganda rather than liberty. The inventions themselves remain inevitable, for human curiosity cannot be stilled, but their use, their meaning, their timing, all these are fragile, dependent on choices made in silence, on wars delayed, on sparks absent. Technology is not destiny. It is a tool, and in this world, those tools may build futures more uncertain than the ones we know. And so, as we step away from laboratories and factories, as we let the hum of machines fade, we must widen the spiral again. For technology shapes not only war but memory, not only weapons but the way the world recalls itself. In this alternate world, where invention unfolds differently, the memory of the war itself is transformed. The monuments, the museums, the textbooks all tell different stories, shaped by absence as much as by presence. And so our journey must now turn to that final fragile realm, the global memory of a war that never unfolded as we knew it. The silence of monuments never built, the echoes of sacrifices never made. The hum of machines fades, the laboratories fall silent, and what remains is not invention but remembrance. For every war, whatever its outcome, is carried forward not only in treaties and borders, but in memory, in monuments raised, in museums built, in stories told around firesides. Our own history remembers the Second World War as a crucible of sacrifice, a triumph of endurance, a moment when nations came together against tyranny. The photographs of Normandy, the ruins of Hiroshima, the flags over Iwo Jima, all these images form the fabric of a shared memory, teaching generations what it meant to live in those years. But in this alternate world, where Pearl Harbor never came, where America delayed, where the Axis endured longer or more securely, memory itself takes on a different shape. The war remembered is not the war we know, and the absence of America's decisive presence leaves absences in memory as wide as oceans. Imagine the museums of London in this world. Instead of exhibits celebrating the joint triumph of Allied arms, their halls might tell a quieter, more somber story of endurance without victory, of survival through compromise. Glass cases might display ration books and gas masks, reminders of years endured without final relief. Photographs of bombed-out streets might be accompanied not by triumphant captions of eventual liberation, but by notes of resilience tinged with fatigue. The legend of defiance, "We shall never surrender," would remain, but perhaps less as a victory cry and more as a haunting memory of resistance that bought time but little else. For a Britain forced into negotiation or left isolated for too long, the monuments would not be those of conquest, but of survival. Their meaning changed. Now picture the memory of Russia. In our history, the Great Patriotic War is remembered with reverence. A story of unimaginable sacrifice and eventual triumph, a central pillar of national identity. In this alternate timeline, without American convoys, without decisive aid, the suffering would be greater, the sacrifices heavier, the victories fewer or later. If the Soviet Union collapsed, its memory would be one of betrayal and grief, stories whispered of a war lost, of families broken, of a nation divided. If it endured, its pride would be fiercer still, its claim to victory even more exclusive, its monuments towering higher to remind future generations that it fought alone, that it bled more deeply than any other. The memory of Russia would be sharpened, made harsher, its narrative less shared with allies and more defined against them. In either case, the war's remembrance would carve scars into identity, shaping how generations saw themselves and their place in the world. And in Asia, memory would be darker still. In our history, the memory of Japanese occupation lingers in Korea, in China, in Southeast Asia, as a story of suffering, resistance, and eventual liberation. But here, without America's decisive counterstroke, occupation might last longer, its scars deeper. Generations would remember not just years of hardship, but perhaps decades. The museums of Jakarta or Kuala Lumpur might tell of a time when the rising sun ruled unchecked, when resistance was crushed, when independence was delayed. Monuments might stand not to liberation in 1945, but to rebellion smothered in the 1950s or 1960s, their memory more bitter, their stories less hopeful. Memory here would not be of victory achieved with Allied aid, but of endurance under occupation, of freedom delayed too long. And what of America itself? In our world, the memory of the Second World War is central to national identity. The generation that fought is remembered as the greatest. It sacrificed the foundation of post-war confidence. Veterans returned as heroes, monuments rose in their honor, and films, books, and songs enshrined their stories and culture. Without Pearl Harbor, without Normandy, without Iwo Jima, what becomes of that memory? Perhaps there would be fewer monuments, fewer stories of shared sacrifice, fewer veterans to march in parades. The memory of the 1940s might be one of hesitation, of debates unresolved, of prosperity at home while others suffered abroad. Instead of triumph, remembrance might carry tones of regret, of what if, of opportunities missed. American memory might not look back with pride, but with unease. A nation haunted by its silence in a time of fire. Memory also shapes imagination. The novels of the post-war years, the films of the 1950s, the stories told in classrooms, all these would differ. Instead of tales of heroism on the beaches of Normandy, perhaps novels would dwell on the endurance of Britain alone, or the starvation of Leningrad, or the occupation of Asia. Instead of films showing American soldiers liberating camps, perhaps films would show the sorrow of survivors left without rescue, or the bitter compromises of nations forced to bow. Children would grow up not with stories of American triumph, but with stories of American hesitation, their vision of the world less confident, their sense of destiny less certain. A nation's memory is its mirror, and in this world the mirror reflects hesitation more than heroism. And yet, even in this altered memory, other truths would endure. The suffering of families, the courage of resistance fighters, the resilience of ordinary people, all these would still be remembered, perhaps with even greater intensity. If liberation was delayed, its eventual arrival, whether in the 1950s or later, would be remembered as sweeter, harder won. If defeat came, its memory would inspire future generations to resist tyranny in other forms. Memory does not vanish simply because history bends, it reshapes, it reinterprets, it carries forward different lessons. The war in this alternate world would still be remembered, but remembered differently, as a story of endurance rather than triumph, of silence rather than thunder, of waiting rather than decisive action. And what of the monuments not built? The absence itself would speak. There would be no Arlington sections filled with fallen from Normandy, no rows of white crosses on the cliffs of France marking American sacrifice. There would be no photographs of sailors raising flags on Pacific islands, no memorials to bridges crossed under fire. In their place would be other absences, harder to mark, but no less real. The empty fields where victories never came, the families whose sons lived but never fought, the generations who remembered debate instead of action. Memory is not only about what is present, it is also about what is missing, the silences that echo louder than words. Thus, the memory of this alternate war becomes as fragile as the history itself. It is a memory defined not by certainty, but by absence, not by triumph, but by hesitation, not by victory, but by endurance. It is a memory that raises questions more than it provides answers, that leaves future generations not with confidence, but with doubt. And in that doubt lies the open question that history itself cannot resolve. What world do we live in because of the choices not made, the actions not taken, the silences not broken? From here our spiral widens one last time, returning to the place where it began. For the memory of this war, however altered, however fragile, always leads us back to the quiet waters of Pearl Harbor. The harbor that in our world erupted in fire remains still in this timeline, its ships untouched, its sailors unaware. And yet, from that silence, an entire world reshaped itself. To end, we must return to those waters, to that moment, to the open question with which we began. What if the bombs never fell, and history itself flowed differently? We return at last to the Pacific, to the harbor where this story first diverged. The waters of Oahu are calm, the sky unbroken by the drone of aircraft, the decks of American battleships gleaming in the sunlight. No plumes of smoke rise here, no thunder of bombs splits the air, no desperate voices call through radios. The harbor remains silent, as if the world itself has paused, as if history has taken a breath and chosen another path. It is from this stillness that all the alternate layers we have traced have unfolded the hesitation of America, the endurance of Britain, the bleeding of Russia, the triumph of Japan, the shadows cast by technology and memory. The harbor's silence is the seed, and from it grows an entirely different forest of history, vast and tangled, its branches reaching into decades yet unborn. But even as we return to this beginning, we see it now not as a single moment, but as the fulcrum of a world. For Pearl Harbor's absence is not simply the absence of battle, it is the absence of clarity, of unity, of outrage. In our world, that morning bound America to the war in a single instant, sweeping away hesitation with fire and grief. In this alternate world, without that moment, everything slows, bends, shifts, time stretches, and choices weigh heavier. Allies endure longer alone. Enemies grow stronger, more entrenched. The balance of technology tilts. The shape of memory reshapes itself. What seems at first the stillness of peace becomes instead the silence of hesitation, a silence that echoes louder than explosions. Imagine again the sailors on those ships, their uniforms crisp, their routines ordinary. They laugh, they write letters, they play cards on deck, unaware of how different their lives have become. In our world, many would fall that morning, their names etched forever into memorials. Here they live, They return home after service, or perhaps never leave at all, their futures unmarked by sudden war. Their survival is a mercy, yet their absence from battle reshapes the course of nations. For each sailor spared, a world is altered. For each bomb that never fell, a question remains. What is saved, and what is lost, when history chooses silence over thunder? From this harbor, the ripples extend outward. Britain wavers but endures, its people scarred by years of bombing, its leaders tempted by negotiation, its empire trembling. Russia suffers, more isolated than ever, its fate balanced between collapse, survival, or desperate compromise. Japan rises to its greatest height, its empire vast, its grip on Asia heavy, its shadow cast across seas and continents. America remains restless, divided, its factories half idle, its people uncertain whether to fight or to wait. The world does not end in one sudden blaze, but it changes in silence, reshaped by choices deferred, by sparks that never ignite. The Second World War, in this telling, is not a story of thunderous resolution, but of long hesitation, of paths winding, of futures uncertain. And yet, as we gaze upon this alternate world, we see not only its dangers but its mysteries. Perhaps hesitation saves lives, sparing millions who in our history perished on beaches and in cities under fire. Perhaps delay allows different voices to rise, movements of independence and rebellion unbound by American dominance. Perhaps the post-war order, though darker in some ways, carries with it new forms of resistance, new struggles for freedom, new stories of endurance. History never closes its doors entirely. Even when one path is blocked, others open, waiting to be walked. The silence of Pearl Harbor, though heavy, may still lead to light in unexpected places. And so we spiral outward, from the harbor to the ocean, from the ocean to the world. The questions grow larger, their answers more elusive. Would America's eventual awakening have been more powerful for its delay or too late to matter? Would Britain's compromise have preserved its empire or destroyed it sooner? Would Russia's fate have reshaped Europe in ways unimaginable, or would its collapse have ended resistance entirely? Would Japan's triumph have lasted a decade, or only sown the seeds of its own undoing? The silence of one morning in Hawaii reverberates through every corner of the globe, filling the century with echoes that never fade. And as we end, we return once more to the image with which we began. The harbor, quiet. The waters smooth. The ships at rest. The world seems calm, but the calm is deceptive. A pause before storms. A silence filled with questions. History does not shout here. It whispers. It whispers of what might have been, of choices not made, of paths not taken. It invites us not to answer but to wonder, not to conclude, but to imagine. And in that imagination lies the true power of alternate history, not certainty, but possibility, not closure, but the opening of thought. So let the harbor fade now, its waters still, its silence deep. Let the images of Britain's endurance, Russia's suffering, Japan's triumph, America's hesitation drift like smoke into the night. Let the questions linger, gentle but insistent, until they dissolve into dreams. For history, like sleep, is a place where possibilities unfold endlessly, where silence can be as powerful as thunder, and where the future is always a question, never a certainty. Close your eyes, then, and let the harbor's stillness guide you into rest. The world we know is only one among many, and in the quiet of imagination, the others live too, waiting for us to walk their paths in thought. The bombs never fell, the waters remained calm, and the future yours, mine, ours flows onward like the tide, eternal, uncertain, always beginning again.